It started on a Friday afternoon when I decided to take a solo trip to a cabin I had rented for the weekend. It wasn't too far from where I lived, but far enough to get away from the constant noise and distractions of everyday life. I had been feeling overwhelmed for a while and needed the time alone, a quiet space to breathe and think. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. When I found it online, it seemed perfect, remote, cozy, and surrounded by trees. The photos of it had given off an old-time charm, with its wooden walls and small porch overlooking a creek. The description said it was secluded, and that was exactly what I wanted. No one would be around, just me, nature, and some time to relax. I parked my car in the dirt driveway and stood there for a moment, taking in the surroundings. The trees were tall and thick, casting long shadows across the ground. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, and the air smelled fresh, like damp earth and pine. The only sound was the creek gurgling in the distance, and the occasional call of birds. The cabin itself was smaller than I had imagined, but perfect for one person. It had a stone fireplace inside, a small kitchen, and a loft bedroom with a view of the trees. It was exactly what I needed: peaceful, simple, and quiet. I felt a sense of calm wash over me as I unpacked my things, putting my bags in the corner by the door and setting up a little area by the fireplace with a book and a cup of tea. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting an orange glow across the trees. I decided to explore the area around the cabin before it got dark. I grabbed my jacket and headed down the trail that wound through the woods. The path was narrow, lined with ferns and moss-covered rocks, and the air had cooled, making me glad I had brought the jacket. I walked for about half an hour, enjoying the quiet, the sounds of my boots crunching against the forest floor, and the way the light filtered through the leaves. The deeper I went, the more isolated everything felt. The further I got from the cabin, the less familiar it seemed. I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived, and the longer I walked, the more I felt like I was venturing into a place where I didn't belong. At some point, I noticed that the path had become less distinct, the trees thicker, the shadows deeper. It wasn't until I looked up and saw that the sun had nearly set that I realized I had wandered farther than I should have. I turned around, planning to head back, but the path I had been following didn't seem to be there anymore. I paused, trying to figure out where I was. Everything looked the same: trees, rocks, underbrush, but there was no clear way back to the cabin. I wasn't lost exactly, but I wasn't sure which direction to go either. I started walking in what I thought was the right direction, but after a few minutes, I realized the trees looked unfamiliar. The calm I had felt earlier started to fade. The woods were becoming eerily quiet, and the shadows were lengthening as the night closed in. I quickened my pace, hoping to find something recognizable. My heart was starting to race, a tightness in my chest that made it harder to breathe. The quiet was overwhelming, too still, too unnatural. I didn't want to panic. I told myself to stay calm. But then I heard something, a snap of a twig, then another, followed by the sound of footsteps. I stopped dead in my tracks. The forest had always felt so peaceful, so empty. I had always loved the idea of being alone out here, but now that silence felt suffocating. The footsteps sounded like they were behind me, coming closer. I turned around, but there was nothing, no one. I knew the rational thing to do was to keep walking, but a gut feeling told me to stay put, that something wasn't right. The footsteps had stopped. For a few seconds, the silence returned, but it was different. It felt tense, like something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I forced myself to move again, trying not to let fear take over. I walked faster now, my steps quick and uneven. The woods around me seemed to close in, the trees so thick I could barely see the sky anymore. It felt like I was being swallowed by the forest, every direction I turned looking the same, every path seeming to lead me in circles. Then I saw it, a break in the trees, a small clearing ahead. It was faint, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The air felt heavier there, and I could see the ground was disturbed, like someone had been walking through it recently. I approached slowly, my footsteps cautious, trying to keep my breathing steady. But as I got closer, I saw what looked like broken branches scattered on the ground, trampled dirt, and what appeared to be a worn path leading off into the trees. I stood there for a moment, uncertain of what to do. I wanted to turn back, but the path in front of me seemed more like a way out, like it might lead me back to the cabin. The logical part of my brain told me to be careful, but the desperation to get out of the woods overpowered it. I stepped onto the path, following it as it twisted through the trees. It wasn't long before I saw something else, something I had missed earlier. There was a faint light up ahead, not from the sun, but from some kind of fire. My pulse quickened. Could someone else be out here? I had seen no one since arriving, but now I was almost certain I wasn't alone. I pushed forward, the light growing stronger as I got closer. It wasn't a big fire, just a small flickering glow, but it was enough to make me wonder if I had made the right choice. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was being drawn toward it, like it was beckoning me in. But when I broke through the trees and into the clearing, I froze. There was nothing there. No fire, no people, just an empty, overgrown patch of land. For a moment, I felt a wave of dizziness, like I had imagined the whole thing. The path was still there, leading off deeper into the woods. My mind raced. Had I been out here too long? Was I hallucinating? I didn't know what to believe anymore, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to get back to the cabin. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. I retraced my steps, trying to remember which way I had come from. The woods around me now felt like a maze, the trees too thick, the shadows too deep. Every direction felt wrong, but I kept moving. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, I saw it, the faint outline of the cabin through the trees. My legs were shaky, my mind exhausted, but I pushed myself forward, one step after another. When I finally reached the cabin, I didn't feel relief immediately. I locked the door behind me, the sound of the bolt sliding home giving me a small measure of comfort. I sat down on the couch, breathing heavily, trying to calm my racing heart. The events of the evening felt surreal, like they hadn't really happened. But deep down, I knew they had. I wasn't sure if I had been followed, if I had been imagining things, or if something else was going on, but the woods had felt too still, too unnatural. I spent the rest of the night inside, every creak of the cabin making my nerves twitch. When the sun finally rose the next morning, I packed my things and left. I wasn't sure if I would ever go back, but I knew one thing for sure. Some places just don't feel right. And I had learned the hard way that even the quietest spots can hold a danger you can't see. I arrived at the cabin just before dusk. The drive had been long and winding, the kind of road that makes you question your decision to travel alone. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far from any sign of civilization. It was a simple structure, weathered by time, with a small porch and a single window facing the gravel path I'd just come down. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Inside, the cabin was modest. A small kitchenette, a worn-out couch, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was one bedroom with a creaky bed and a bathroom with a rust-stained sink. I unpacked my bag, placing my clothes in the small dresser and setting up my laptop on the kitchen table. I had come here to write, to escape the distractions of the city and find inspiration in solitude. That first night, I lit a fire in the fireplace and sat on the couch, listening to the crackling of the wood and the occasional hoot of an owl outside. The isolation was comforting, a stark contrast to the constant noise I was used to. I went to bed early, the silence lulling me into a deep sleep. I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the porch to the other. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept to the window. There was no one there. The porch was empty, the woods beyond still and silent. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on the porch. They were human, barefoot, and led from the steps to the window and back again. I stared at them, trying to make sense of it. There were no other cabins nearby, no hiking trails that I knew of. I decided to brush it off, convincing myself that maybe a lost hiker had stumbled upon the cabin during the night. I spent the day writing, trying to focus on my work and ignore the lingering anxiety. As the sun set, I locked the door and windows, double-checking each one before settling in for the night. I kept the flashlight close, its beam a small comfort in the darkness. The footsteps returned. This time, they circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, listening as they moved from one side to the other. Then, a knock at the door. 3 soft raps, evenly spaced. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The knocking stopped, and the footsteps retreated into the night. Karen Woodward, 1. GQ, 2. In the morning, I found more footprints, this time leading to the back of the cabin. I decided to hike into town, a small place about 10 miles away, to report the incidents. The local sheriff listened patiently, nodding as I described the events. He told me that sometimes transients passed through the area, using the woods as a shortcut. He promised to send a deputy to check on the cabin that night. Feeling somewhat reassured, I returned to the cabin. That night, I stayed up, waiting for the deputy, but no one came. The footsteps returned, louder this time, more insistent. I sat in the dark, the flashlight in my hand, heart pounding. Then, the doorknob turned slowly, rattling as if someone was trying to open it. I shouted, hoping to scare them off. The noise stopped, and I heard the footsteps retreat once more. The next day, I called the sheriff's office. He apologized, saying the deputy had been called away on an emergency. He assured me someone would come that night. I wasn't convinced. I decided to leave, to pack up and go back to the city. But when I tried to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. I checked my phone, no signal. I was trapped. I spent the day trying to fix the car, but I knew little about engines. As night fell, I locked myself in the cabin, pushing the couch against the door. I sat with the flashlight and a kitchen knife, waiting. The footsteps came again, circling the cabin, stopping at each window. Then silence. I waited, straining to hear. A creak from the roof. Someone was on top of the cabin. I held my breath, heart pounding in my ears. Then, a face appeared at the skylight, peering down at me. I screamed, and the face disappeared. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I gathered my things and set out on foot, heading toward town. After hours of walking, I reached the sheriff's office. I told him everything, from the footsteps to the face at the skylight. He looked concerned and promised to investigate. I never went back to the cabin. I sold it a few months later, never wanting to set foot in those woods again. I still don't know who or what was out there, but I know that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, they're people. Now, back in the city, I lock my doors and windows every night. I check them twice, sometimes 3 times. The sounds of the city, once a nuisance, are now a comfort. The hum of traffic, the distant sirens. They remind me that I'm not alone. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear footsteps outside my apartment door, slow and deliberate. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but I keep the flashlight and the kitchen knife close, just in case. After the last few months, losing my job, the breakup, the constant noise of the city, I felt like I was unraveling. I craved silence, solitude, a place where I could hear myself think. So when I found the listing for a secluded cabin in the woods, miles from the nearest town, it felt like a sign. The owner, an older man named Carl, was terse over the phone. He warned me that the cabin was basic, no electricity, no running water, no cell service. But that was exactly what I wanted. I assured him I could handle it. I packed my car with essentials: canned food, bottled water, a camping stove, a lantern, a few books, and a journal. I also brought a first aid kit, a hunting knife, and a .38 revolver my father had given me years ago. I wasn't expecting trouble, but the idea of being completely alone in the woods made me cautious. The drive took most of the day, As I left the highway and turned onto a narrow dirt road, the trees grew denser, the light dimmer. The GPS lost signal about 10 miles in, but Carl had given me detailed directions. I followed them carefully, counting the turns, watching for the landmarks he described. A bent pine tree, a rusted mailbox, a fallen log. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin was small, made of weathered wood, with a slanted roof and a stone chimney. A porch wrapped around the front, its boards creaking under my weight as I stepped onto it. The door was unlocked, just as Carl had said it would be. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A single room with a wood-burning stove, a table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, and a shelf stocked with firewood. A small window looked out onto the forest. I unpacked my things, lit the lantern, and started a fire in the stove. The warmth and the crackling flames made the place feel cozy. That first night, I slept deeply, lulled by the sounds of the forest. The rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig. It was the first time in months that I felt at peace. The days settled into a routine. I would wake with the sun, make coffee on the camping stove, and sit on the porch, sipping it as I watched the forest come alive. Birds chirped, squirrels darted through the underbrush, and deer sometimes wandered near the clearing. I spent my mornings hiking the nearby trails, exploring the woods, and gathering kindling. Afternoons were for reading, writing in my journal, and napping. Evenings, I cooked simple meals, listened to the fire crackle, and let my mind wander. It was idyllic. But then, on the 5th day, things began to change. It started with the footprints. I was returning from a hike when I noticed them. A set of boot prints in the soft earth near the cabin. They were fresh, not there when I had left that morning. I froze, scanning the area, but saw no one. The prints led from the edge of the clearing to the porch, then back into the woods. I told myself it was probably Carl checking in, but he had said he wouldn't be around. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I went inside, locked the door, and kept the revolver close that night. Wikipedia 1. The next morning, I found a small pile of stones stacked neatly on the porch. A cairn like those hikers used to mark trails. I hadn't built it. I dismantled it, unease settling in my stomach. Wikipedia 1. Dabble 2. That night, I dreamed of footsteps crunching through leaves, of someone standing over me as I slept. I woke in a cold sweat, the lantern flickering. Over the next few days, more signs appeared. A crude figure made of twigs and twine hung from a tree near the cabin. Scratches appeared on the door, as if made by a knife. Once, I found a dead rabbit on the porch, its throat slit. I was being watched. I could feel it. The sense of peace I had found was replaced by a constant tension, a knot in my gut that wouldn't loosen. I stopped hiking, stayed close to the cabin, kept the revolver on me at all times. I considered leaving, but the road was long, and I wasn't sure I could make it back without incident. Then, one night, I heard it. Footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, heart pounding, as they moved from one side to the other. Then silence. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, loaded the car, and started down the dirt road. But a mile in, I found a tree felled across the path, blocking my way. It hadn't been there before. I got out, examined it. The cut was clean, made with a saw. Someone had done this deliberately. I tried to move it, but it was too heavy. I considered hiking out, but the nearest town was miles away, and I didn't feel safe leaving the car. I returned to the cabin, barricaded the door, and waited. That night, they came. I heard the footsteps again, more of them this time. Voices, low and indistinct, murmured outside. Then, a knock at the door. I didn't answer. The knocking continued, louder, more insistent. Then silence. I sat in the dark, revolver in hand, waiting. Hours passed. Eventually, I fell into a restless sleep. In the morning, I found symbols carved into the trees around the cabin. strange, angular shapes I didn't recognize. I felt a growing sense of dread. I knew I couldn't stay. I gathered my things, left the car, and started hiking. I kept the revolver ready, eyes scanning the woods. After hours of walking, I reached a ranger station. I told them everything. They went back with me, but the cabin was empty. No signs of anyone else. They dismissed it as an overactive imagination, maybe a prank. But I knew the truth. Someone had been watching me. Someone who didn't want me there. I never went back. I booked the cabin without really thinking it through. I'd been working 10-hour shifts for months, and I was just tired. Tired of my phone buzzing. Tired of emails. Tired of city noise. I didn't care where I went. I found an old rental listing online, saw that the cabin was cheap, remote, and had a working fireplace, and I booked it within 10 minutes. It was in northern Michigan, a bit past Grayling, buried in the trees off a narrow road that didn't even show up on Google Maps. The owner emailed me basic directions. Follow County Road 612, turn left at a rusted mailbox with no house number, and keep going until the road turned to gravel. Then I'd see a locked gate, and beyond that, a short trail leading to the cabin. It sounded rustic and quiet. That's all I needed. I left work late the night before and drove through the early morning, watching as the busy roads thinned out. The gas stations became fewer, and cell service faded. By the time I reached that rusted mailbox, I hadn't seen another car in half an hour. The gravel road past the gate was overgrown, but drivable. I followed it slowly, the trees closing in tighter on either side, branches brushing the car. The cabin appeared suddenly in a small clearing, tucked between tall pines. It looked just like the photos, dark wood siding, a moss-covered roof, a wraparound porch with a single rocking chair. The place was old, probably built before the 1950s, but it didn't look unsafe. I parked and grabbed my backpack, walked up the 3 steps, and unlocked the door with the code I was given. Inside, it smelled like wood smoke and dust. The furniture was basic, just a small couch, a table, 2 chairs, and a shelf lined with books. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, not even a clock. The bedroom had a double bed with a heavy quilt, and the bathroom had running water, though the sink sputtered a bit when I first turned the tap. The place was completely silent. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, and that was it. It was perfect. That first day, I unpacked, took a nap, and then went for a walk. There was a path behind the cabin, narrow and mostly covered in pine needles, that led deeper into the woods. I walked for about 20 minutes before turning back. I didn't want to get lost, and I had no GPS. That night, I lit a fire and made a simple dinner, canned chili and a sandwich. I read one of the books from the shelf and went to bed early. I slept well. The second day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I chopped some firewood from the small pile out back. The axe was rusty but usable. I explored around the clearing, noticing animal tracks in the dirt. Deer, mostly, and maybe a raccoon. I cooked some eggs and sat on the porch with my coffee, watching the trees sway in the breeze. It was so quiet that every little sound stood out. A squirrel moving through dry leaves sounded like something much bigger. That night, I heard something outside. It was late. I was in bed, just starting to drift off, when I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps, then a soft creak, like someone putting weight on the rocking chair. I froze. My first thought was that someone had followed me. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps didn't continue. After a few minutes, I got up quietly, crept to the window, and peeked through the curtain. The porch was empty. The chair wasn't moving. There was nothing. I told myself it had been an animal, a raccoon maybe, or the wind. I went back to bed and fell asleep eventually. The next day, I didn't feel relaxed anymore. I kept looking over my shoulder. I had that prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I kept hearing things. Twigs snapping in the woods, leaves rustling. When I walked to the trail behind the cabin, I noticed something strange. A new footprint in the dirt. Not an animal print, a boot print. It was deeper than mine and longer. Someone had been there, I looked around but didn't see anyone. I walked the trail again, trying to calm myself down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. That night, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle. I turned off the lights and sat on the couch, listening. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. Same slow steps across the porch. Then nothing. I didn't look out the window this time. I just waited. Eventually, I fell asleep sitting up. The next morning, I found something disturbing. The axe, which I had left leaning against the woodpile, was gone. In its place was a rock, perfectly smooth, round stone. I hadn't seen anything like it around the property. Someone had been there. I decided to leave. I packed quickly, grabbed my keys, and went outside. That's when I realized my car wouldn't start. I turned the key and got nothing, not even a click. I opened the hood but didn't know what to look for. I checked my phone, still no service. I felt panic rising in my chest. I was stuck. I was alone. Someone had been on the property. Maybe they were still around. I went back inside and tried to think. I found a map in one of the drawers, an old topographic map with trails and logging roads. There was a ranger station marked about 5 miles away. I decided to walk. I took a backpack with water, a flashlight, and a small knife I found in the kitchen drawer. I locked the door behind me and started down the trail. It was hot, and the bugs were relentless. The trail was rough, sometimes disappearing completely, and I had to push through branches and duck under fallen trees. I walked for over 2 hours without seeing anything. Then I found another trail, wider and easier to follow. I checked the map and guessed it was an old logging road. I followed it. That's when I saw the first sign. A shredded flannel shirt hanging from a branch. It looked like it had been there for a while, faded and torn, but there were dark stains on it. I didn't look closely. I kept walking. Further down the trail, I found a campsite. Just a fire ring and some trash, old cans, a broken lantern, a boot with a hole in it. No tent, no people. I called out just once, then stopped. It felt wrong to make noise. I kept walking. Eventually, I saw the ranger station. A small building with a metal roof and a locked door. No vehicles, no sign of life. I banged on the door and waited. Nothing. I checked the back and found a busted window. I climbed through. Inside, it was dusty and abandoned. Papers were scattered everywhere. The phone didn't work. I found a first aid kit and a radio, but the batteries were dead. I sat down and tried to think. Then I heard something outside. A single footstep, then another. I turned off my flashlight and crouched down. Through the cracked window, I saw a figure walking up the trail. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. No backpack, just walking slowly toward the building. I didn't wait. I climbed out the back window and ran. I didn't follow the trail. I crashed through the woods, trying to move quietly, but failing. I tripped more than once. I scraped my arms on branches. I didn't stop until I couldn't hear anything but my own breathing. I spent the night in the woods. I didn't sleep. I kept my back to a tree, flashlight off, knife in hand. Every sound made my heart race. At dawn, I started walking again. I had no idea where I was, but I headed east, keeping the sun to my right. After several hours, I stumbled out of the forest onto a dirt road. I followed it for miles until I saw a truck parked near a trailhead. A man and a woman were loading gear into the back. They looked at me like I was crazy. I probably did. I was covered in dirt and scratches, and I hadn't slept in 2 days. I told them I was lost. They gave me water and drove me to a gas station with a payphone. I called the sheriff. I told him where the cabin was and what had happened. He said they'd send someone to check it out. A few days later, I got a call. They found the cabin. They found my car, but no footprints, no signs of anyone else. The axe was there again, right where I had left it. No rock. Nothing was out of place. They said I probably panicked, got spooked, imagined things. Stress, maybe. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Someone was out there. I'll never go back. Since then, I've stuck to hotels. I don't care how loud or busy they are. I'll take the sound of traffic and sirens over that kind of silence. I'll never trust the woods again, and I'll never forget the feeling I had out there. like I was being hunted by something that never needed to rush, something that just waited, silent and patient, for me to break. I had always been drawn to the woods, especially after I'd had a rough year. It felt like the perfect time to get away from everything, to find some peace and solitude. So, when I found a small cabin up in the mountains, nestled among the towering pine trees, I didn't hesitate for a second. The pictures looked perfect, rustic, isolated, and quiet. Everything I was looking for. The drive up was long and winding. The further I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. After a couple of hours, the roads turned to gravel, and the trees grew denser. I could feel the weight of the isolation pressing in on me. It wasn't a bad feeling, though. It was just different. I hadn't realized how much I needed to be far away from the noise, the people, the constant demands of everyday life. Finally, I reached the cabin. It was just as I'd expected, small, wooden, with a steep roof that looked like it could withstand a heavy snowstorm. The front porch had a couple of chairs, but no sign of any other human presence for miles. Just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional bird calling in the distance. I felt a small thrill of excitement. I unloaded my things, settled in, and started a fire in the stone fireplace. The cabin smelled like old wood and pine, a scent I found oddly comforting. The crackling of the fire was the only sound inside. Outside, the wind began to pick up, making the trees sway. As the night drew closer, the temperature dropped, and I wrapped myself in a thick blanket. The wind howled outside, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. It wasn't anything specific, just a strange feeling that I couldn't shake. I pushed it aside, reminding myself that I was here for peace and quiet. It was around midnight when I first heard it. A faint tapping sound, like something lightly knocking on the window. My first thought was that it was just a branch, blown by the wind, but when the tapping continued, my heart started to race. I stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound. The fire had died down, leaving only the soft glow of embers. The room felt too quiet, almost suffocating. I walked to the window, but there was nothing out there. No animals, no wind blowing anything against the glass. Just darkness and the rustling of the trees. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the unease remained. I locked the door and checked all the windows, though I knew they were already secured. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made my skin crawl. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to force myself to sleep. But the tapping sound wouldn't leave my mind. It wasn't something I could ignore. The next morning, I decided to go for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The sun was out, and the weather was calm, the forest peaceful. I followed a narrow path that wound through the trees, hoping to lose myself in the quiet. But as I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. I was alone. There was no sign of animals, no birds, no squirrels, no rustling in the bushes. It was as if the entire forest had gone silent. I stopped for a moment listening, but the only sound was the wind. I shook it off, thinking it was just the isolation getting to me. I continued walking, but then I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. At the edge of the path, barely visible through the trees, was something I couldn't quite make out. It looked like a pile of rocks, but it was too neatly arranged. I took a few steps closer, and my heart began to race. It wasn't just a pile of rocks. It was a small structure, almost like a cairn, but there were symbols carved into the rocks, symbols that I didn't recognize. They were worn by time, but still visible, as if they had been placed there recently. I stepped back, my mind racing. The isolation of the cabin, the weird feeling I had the night before, and now this. I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was just some weird marker or an old trail. Still, I decided to leave it alone. I turned around and walked back to the cabin, trying to shake the feeling of unease. That night, the tapping came again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. I froze, my heart pounding. I didn't want to get up again, didn't want to face whatever was making that noise, but I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I grabbed the flashlight and walked to the window, shining the beam outside. There was nothing out there, not a single thing, but the tapping continued. I bolted the door and checked the windows again. This time, I didn't feel safe. I couldn't explain why, but the thought of being alone in that cabin terrified me. I locked every window and door, turned off the lights, and crawled into bed, clutching the blankets tightly. As I lay there, trying to calm myself, the tapping stopped. For a moment, everything was silent, but then I heard something else. A soft, slow scraping sound coming from the roof. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The scraping continued, growing louder, like something dragging across the shingles. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number for the local sheriff's office, but there was no signal. I was completely alone. There was no one who could help me. The scraping stopped after what felt like an eternity. I lay there, waiting for the sound to return, but nothing came. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise itself. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of anything. What had I just heard? What was out there? The rest of the night passed in a blur. I barely slept, my mind filled with questions and doubts. By morning, I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. I packed my things quickly, my hands trembling as I gathered my gear. I didn't want to stay there another night, not with the feeling of something watching me. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being hunted, though I couldn't explain why. As I drove down the long, winding road, away from the cabin, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The cabin sat in the distance, shrouded by trees, completely still. But as I looked closer, I saw something on the porch. A figure, just standing there, unmoving. I sped up, not daring to look back again. Whatever had happened at that cabin, I wasn't going to find out. The place had a strange, unsettling energy to it, something that didn't feel right. It wasn't a place for peace. It wasn't a place to escape. I never returned. To this day, I don't know what made the noises or what I saw on the porch. But I know one thing for sure, I made the right choice when I left. The cabin is still there, somewhere deep in the woods, but I've never looked for it again, and I never will. I rented a cabin up in northern Wisconsin during the last week of October. I wanted somewhere quiet and isolated, just for a while. Work had been chewing me up for the last several months, and I felt like I couldn't hear myself think anymore. I found the listing online. It looked decent enough. 1-bedroom log cabin with stove, basic kitchen, generator for power. It was way up past Minocqua, a couple of miles down a private road that cut into thick woods. When I got there, the air smelled like pine and the damp earth. It had just rained the night before. Everything was soft and cold, with wet leaves pressed into the gravel driveway. The place looked smaller in person. The porch sagged a bit on one side, paint peeled on the window frames, but it felt right, quiet, secluded. All I heard was the occasional crow and the wind moving through the trees. I unpacked slowly. I brought enough food for a week, mostly dry stuff, cans, rice, pasta. I brought my camp stove just in case the kitchen didn't work, but the propane-powered stove worked fine. There was running water from a well pump, and the generator hummed steadily when I started it. It wasn't luxury, but I didn't want that. I wanted silence. That first day, I mostly walked around. The cabin sat on about 10 acres of land, all wooded except for a small clearing out back with a rusted fire pit and 2 broken lawn chairs. Behind that, the forest thickened quickly. I wandered maybe a mile into it before turning back, not wanting to get turned around without cell service. The forest felt heavy, like the trees leaned in when you weren't looking. The nights were darker than I expected. Even with the generator running and the porch light on, everything past the clearing was pitch black. I tried reading the first night, but I kept feeling like something was out there in the trees. Nothing specific, just that weird sense like you're being watched. I chalked it up to being alone and tired. Still, I locked the doors. The second day, I started chopping some wood. There was a pile of logs already, but they were damp. I found a few fallen trees out past the clearing, dry enough to split. I spent hours hauling and splitting. My hands got raw even with gloves. I hadn't worked like that in years. Felt good in a way, tiring but focused. That night, something woke me. It was just after 2 a.m. I looked at my phone, which I kept in airplane mode to save battery. The generator had kicked off around midnight, which was normal. I was only running it for a few hours at a time to save fuel. The cabin was dead silent. No hum, no wind. I sat up and listened. I heard a noise outside, not loud, just a light crunch of leaves. Then another. I froze. It was probably an animal, I thought, a deer or a raccoon. But the steps were slow, steady, and they stopped near the porch. I waited a long time, holding my breath. I couldn't see out the window. There were no curtains, just black glass reflecting the room. I didn't move. Eventually, after what felt like 10 minutes, I heard the steps again, this time moving away, slower now. I stayed up another hour before falling asleep again. Next morning, I checked around the cabin. No footprints, but the ground was packed and dry. Hard to tell. I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe I scared it off when I sat up, but something felt off. I kept thinking about how steady the steps were. I kept to the cabin that day. I read, made food, chopped more wood, tried to settle my nerves. That night, I ran the generator until almost 10 and left a light on in the main room. I put a heavy chair against the door. Around the same time, 2 a.m., I woke up again. This time I didn't hear anything at first, just silence. But then something scraped across the porch, like metal on wood, just once. I got out of bed quietly and picked up the flashlight I kept next to me. I didn't turn it on. I just listened. A few seconds later, I heard the sound again, closer, stopped at the door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just stood there in the dark. Then something pushed against the door. It didn't try to open it. It just pressed against it. Once. Then it was still. I don't know how long I stood there. Eventually, I sat back down on the edge of the bed, the flashlight in my lap. I waited. I must have fallen asleep sitting up, because the next thing I knew, light was coming through the window. When I opened the door that morning, I saw the marks. Something had dragged a long piece of metal across the wooden boards. It looked like a crowbar or a metal rod, and something had pressed against the door hard enough to leave a faint mark at shoulder height. Too high for most animals. I didn't like it, not at all. I considered leaving that day, but I felt stupid. Maybe it was some local kid screwing around. Maybe it was nothing. I didn't want to be the guy who ran from shadows. That afternoon, I walked further into the woods, looking for signs of anyone else nearby. I found a trail I hadn't noticed before, barely visible under the leaves. It curved around a low ridge and then disappeared into thicker trees. I followed it for maybe half a mile before I found something strange. An old tree with nails hammered into it. Dozens of them, rusted and bent. Some driven in deep, some just barely. I looked around and didn't see any other sign of human activity. No old campsites, no trash, just that tree. I took a few photos and went back to the cabin. That night, I kept the generator on longer. Couldn't sleep. I stayed in the main room with the lights on, staring out the window. Nothing happened until around 3 a.m. I was drifting off when I heard it again. Footsteps. This time I turned off the light. I moved to the far side of the room and waited. The steps came up to the porch. Slow, deliberate. Then I heard something metal again. A light clink, then silence. I waited for what felt like forever. Eventually, the steps moved away. Next morning, I found a long nail stuck into the doorframe. Not deep, just pressed in, like someone wanted to mark the door. That was it. I packed up that morning. I didn't even clean up. I threw everything into the truck and left by noon. I didn't look back. A week later, I got a call from the property owner. He said he went up to the cabin to check it out. He asked if I had driven nails into the trees around the property. I told him no. He said he found 6 of them, all in a circle, all fresh. I never went back. I still don't know who or what was out there, but it was real, and it wasn't an animal. I didn't imagine it. The marks were real. The footsteps, the nail in the door. Someone was watching that cabin, and they didn't want me there. I moved on with life after that, but I think about it sometimes, especially when I'm alone in the woods. I still go camping, still hike, but I never stay too far from people anymore. And I don't rent cabins out in the middle of nowhere anymore, no matter how peaceful they look. Peace and quiet aren't worth it when someone else is already living in the silence. I drove up the mountain on a Friday afternoon in early October. The trees had started to change colors, and the air felt crisp and dry, the way it usually did before a long cold snap. I'd rented a cabin up there for 4 days to get away from work and the city noise. I needed time alone. I didn't want to talk to anyone or hear anything but the wind and my own breathing. It had been a hard year, and I thought some time away in the woods might settle my nerves. The drive was smooth until I reached the final stretch, a narrow gravel road that wound up through thick pine woods. My tires kicked up dust that hung in the air behind me. I passed maybe 2 other cabins that looked shut tight for the season, their driveways empty. Mine was farther up, isolated, no other buildings in sight once I parked. The cabin looked smaller than I expected, built from old gray logs, the roof sagging slightly on one side. It had a front porch with a bench swing and one dim porch light that flickered when I turned it on. Inside, it was basic. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a narrow living room with a wood stove and an old couch. There was no TV, no internet, and no phone reception. Just me and the trees. I unpacked slowly, putting my bags down in the bedroom and checking the kitchen. The fridge worked, powered by a propane generator out back, and the cupboards had a few canned goods. I'd brought enough food to last and some books. After dinner, I sat on the porch with a beer and watched the sky darken. The silence felt heavy at first, but then something about it was calming. No engines, no people, just the faint sound of wind and the occasional creak of the trees. That night, I struggled to sleep. The bed was firm, and the cabin creaked when the wind hit it. Around midnight, I heard a thump on the wall outside. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like something hitting the logs. I waited, listening, but it didn't happen again. I chalked it up to a branch or a small animal and eventually drifted off. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for what might have caused the sound. I didn't see anything strange, but I did find prints in the dirt around the side of the house. Not boot prints, bare feet. The toes were spread wide, almost like someone had been walking slowly around the place with no shoes. The prints weren't fresh, maybe from the day before, and I told myself they could belong to someone passing through. Maybe a local hiker. Still, it made me uneasy. I hiked later that day, following a trail that looped around the hill behind the cabin. The trail was barely marked, just some old blazes on tree trunks. After about 2 hours, I circled back and made it to the cabin before sunset. I sat by the wood stove that evening, reading, then went to bed early. Again, around midnight, I heard that same sound. A single thump. I stayed still, my heart beating fast. Then came a second sound. A slow drag against the wood, like someone sliding their hand or foot across the outer wall. I got out of bed quietly and looked through the window. It was too dark to see anything. I didn't go outside. I waited, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the door. Nothing else happened that night. On Sunday morning, I found new prints. This time they were fresher, pressed into the dirt near the back door. Again, bare feet. Whoever it was had stood there, motionless, for some time. The dirt showed deep impressions from both feet, and the surrounding area was undisturbed. I walked a wide circle around the cabin that day. The forest was quiet. I didn't see or hear anyone, but the feeling of being watched started to creep in. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and every time I stepped on a dry twig, I jumped. That night, I locked the front and back doors, even though the place was already remote. I moved the couch in front of the back door, just to be sure. The wood stove burned slow and steady, casting a soft orange glow across the room. I stayed up later, listening. Just before 1 in the morning, I heard it again. This time, footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They stopped right in front of the door. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The steps didn't move again. No knocking, no thump, just silence. Then a quiet creak from the porch swing, as if someone had sat down gently. I sat there until the fire burned low and the cabin went dark. I didn't sleep. When the sky lightened outside, I finally moved to the window and peeked out. Nothing. The swing was still. The porch was empty. I opened the front door slowly and stepped outside. The air was cold and still. The swing moved slightly in the breeze. Then I looked down. There were footprints. Bare, slightly muddy. They led from the steps to the swing and back again, disappearing down the trail into the woods. I wanted to leave right then, but the idea of packing up and driving that gravel road half asleep didn't feel safe. I decided to wait until daylight fully broke. I stayed outside on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, gripping a heavy flashlight like a weapon. When I finally drove away later that morning, I didn't look back. I felt watched the whole way down that winding road. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe easy until I reached the main road and saw another car. I never found out who it was or why they came to the cabin. There were no reports, no signs of break-in, nothing stolen. The owners said they'd never had trouble before. Maybe it was someone living off-grid. Maybe someone with mental health problems. Maybe someone just curious and strange. But I know what I saw. I know those footprints were fresh. I know I heard them. I know they came back night after night, getting closer each time. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I still take time off when I need it, but now I stay where there are people nearby, where there's phone service, where I can call for help if I need to. The quiet isn't as peaceful as I once thought. Sometimes silence hides things. Sometimes silence listens. I'm not really the kind of person who scares easy. I've hiked alone, camped in all kinds of weather, driven through blizzards, and once got lost in the Smoky Mountains with no GPS. Still, nothing prepared me for what happened that week in the northern woods. It started out as something I thought I needed. A break from people, noise, and constant movement. I figured a week alone in a quiet cabin would clear my head. What I got was a slow unraveling I still don't fully understand. The cabin was a small place up near the Canadian border, maybe 20 minutes from a tiny town you'd miss if you blinked. I booked it online, saw a few pictures, and it looked fine. Plain but cozy. One room, a fireplace, a bed, a small kitchen, and a front porch. It was deep in the woods, just where I wanted to be. I brought enough food, firewood, and supplies to last a week. I told a few people where I was going, even gave them the GPS coordinates just to be safe. The drive took longer than I expected. A lot of back roads, a couple wrong turns, and the last stretch was a narrow gravel path with thick trees on either side. I didn't see another car for miles. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, and the shadows were stretching across the clearing. The place was quiet, peaceful. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and breathed in the cold, earthy air. It smelled like pine with smoke and dirt. The cabin looked just like the pictures, maybe a little older, but solid. Inside, everything was simple. A single bed pushed against one wall, a table and chair near a small window, a basic kitchen with a gas stove and an old fridge that ran off propane. The bathroom was just a toilet and a sink, no shower. There was a water pump out back. The fireplace took up most of one wall, and I started a fire almost right away. The temperature was already dropping. I unpacked my gear, made a quick dinner, and sat by the fire for a long time, just listening to the woods settle. The first night was fine. I didn't sleep well, but that was normal the first night anywhere new. The mattress was stiff, and I kept waking up to small noises. Branches creaking, the wind, something scurrying across the roof. Still, I wasn't nervous. I've heard worse sounds camping. In the morning, I chopped some wood, ate breakfast, and took a walk around the property. There was a frozen creek about a quarter-mile downhill, and some old animal tracks in the snow, deer, maybe a fox. That afternoon I read, took notes in a journal, and listened to the radio. There wasn't much signal out there, but I brought a weather radio that worked fine. The fire kept the cabin warm, and I was starting to settle into the rhythm. But just before dark, I noticed something strange. When I stepped out to bring in more firewood, I saw faint boot prints leading toward the cabin from the woods. They weren't mine. They were wider and heavier. At first I thought maybe they'd been there and I missed them, but the snow was fresh. I would have seen them earlier. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. No movement, no sound. It was dead quiet. I followed the prints a little way, but they stopped abruptly about 30 feet from the cabin. Not like someone turned back, just stopped like whoever made them disappeared. I stood there for a while, feeling something heavy settle in my chest. I went back inside, locked the door, and shoved a chair under the knob. That night, I barely slept. Every small noise felt louder. I kept the fire going and sat in the chair by the door for hours, trying to stay calm. Eventually, I must have dozed off because I woke up just after sunrise. Nothing looked disturbed. The snow was smooth again, no new prints. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was just tired and saw animal tracks that looked like boots. But the next day, more things felt off. Around mid-morning, I noticed something on the back wall of the cabin. Thin scratches near the window. They looked fresh, shallow, like someone had dragged a stick or knife along the wood. They weren't there when I arrived. I would have seen them. The strange part was how high they were, maybe 6 feet up. I'm 6'1" and they were at eye level. I tried to stay rational. Maybe an animal had done it. Maybe a branch in the wind. But when I walked the perimeter, I saw more. Faint scratches on the other side too, just beneath the kitchen window. I felt a rising pressure in my chest again, like something waiting just out of sight. I spent most of that day indoors trying to ignore the feeling. I listened to the fire, wrote in my notebook, drank tea, tried reading. That night it got worse. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a thud on the porch. Not a branch falling, not a raccoon. Something heavier, something that stepped. I sat up, heart pounding. The fire had died down, but there was enough light to see the cabin door. I stared at it for a long time, not moving. Another thud, a creak, the sound of something shifting weight. I held my breath. Then it went quiet again. I didn't sleep after that. Just sat in the chair with the axe I brought for chopping wood. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When it did, I stepped outside slowly. Nothing on the porch. No marks. No footprints. But when I walked around to the back, there were more scratches, deeper this time. One of them looked like it had been made with a blade. There were 3 long gouges, one of them almost carving into the wall beneath the window. I made a decision then. I wasn't staying the full week. I'd leave the next morning. I could manage one more night, but I wasn't going to wait around to see what else would happen. I packed up most of my gear that day, loaded it into the car, and kept only what I needed for the night. That evening, I didn't light the fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I kept the lights off and sat in the dark with the axe across my lap. The cold crept in, but I didn't care. I just needed to make it to morning. Around midnight, I heard the crunch of snow outside, slow steps circling. I didn't move. My breath felt shallow. Then came the creak of the porch again. I gripped the axe tighter. A hand, at least it sounded like a hand, tapped lightly on the door. Once, then twice, then silence. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink much. At first light, I opened the door and saw nothing. No prints, no marks. It was like the snow had swallowed everything. But I didn't waste time. I locked up, got in the car, and drove. I didn't stop until I was halfway home. I never reported it. I never went back. I've looked at satellite images of the place since, and it still shows up. The road, the clearing, the small cabin. I've thought about whether someone was playing a game, watching me from the woods, waiting, or maybe it was just a drifter, living rough, keeping out of sight. Whatever it wasn't right. It was too deliberate, too quiet. I've been in the woods long enough to know what animals sound like. This wasn't that, and it wasn't some ghost story either. It was a person, someone patient, someone careful. Since then, I don't go anywhere without telling at least 3 people. I don't camp alone. I don't rent cabins I haven't seen in person. And I never, ever ignore fresh prints in new snow. I got lucky. I left before anything worse happened. But I still think about what might have happened if I hadn't. If I'd stayed one more night. If I'd opened the door. If I hadn't heard those footsteps. Sometimes I still wake up at night, thinking I hear tapping on my door. I lie there in the dark, heart pounding, listening. And I remember that week in the woods, and how close I came to something I don't want to understand. I've always loved being out in nature, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. There's something about being in the woods that makes everything feel simpler, quieter. So when I decided to rent a cabin deep in the forest for a weekend getaway, I thought it would be the perfect break. No phones, no distractions, just me, the forest, and a little bit of peace. The cabin was secluded, far from any roads or other properties. It wasn't fancy, just a small, rustic log cabin with a porch, a fireplace, and a single bedroom. The kind of place you imagine when you think about escaping the modern world. I had seen pictures online and it looked charming enough, but you never really know until you get there. I arrived in the early afternoon, the sun high in the sky, and the temperature just cool enough to feel fresh. The drive up had been long, twisting through narrow, uneven roads that led deeper into the forest. The last few miles had been on a dirt path, bordered by thick trees and the occasional patch of wildflowers. It was quiet, eerily so. There was no sound of traffic, no planes flying overhead, just the occasional rustle of the trees in the wind. The cabin was exactly as described. It had a stone fireplace in the living room, with a pile of firewood stacked neatly beside it. The kitchen was basic, small but functional. There was a single bathroom, and a small bedroom with a bed that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. The air smelled faintly of wood and dust, but nothing unpleasant. Everything felt still, like the cabin had been waiting for me. I unpacked my bags, feeling a little bit of excitement bubbling inside me. I had planned this trip to unwind, maybe read a few books, enjoy the quiet. I didn't really have a set plan for the weekend, but that was the point. I was free to do whatever I wanted. After a few hours of settling in, I decided to take a walk around the area. The cabin was surrounded by dense forest, with only a small clearing around it. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the cool air instantly hitting my face. I walked along a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods, the trees towering over me, blocking out much of the light. The trail wasn't well maintained, but it was still passable. As I walked, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. There were no animals scurrying around, no birds chirping. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional gust of wind. Felt strange, the kind of silence that made you feel like you were the only person on earth. I spent a good hour wandering, lost in the beauty of the forest. But as the light began to fade, I started to feel uneasy. The sun was setting, and the shadows were getting longer. I realized I had wandered further from the cabin than I intended. I turned around and began heading back, but the trail looked different now. The trees seemed to close in around me, the once familiar path now feeling foreign. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling noise. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was a soft, deliberate sound, like footsteps in the leaves. I froze. My heart began to pound in my chest. My mind raced. Was I being followed? I strained my ears, trying to hear any other sounds. But there was nothing, just that same rustling, now closer, and definitely not from the wind. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, maybe an animal or a branch falling from a tree. But the more I listened, the more convinced I became that someone or something was out there. I quickened my pace, my feet moving faster now, the rustling sound still trailing behind me. It wasn't normal and it wasn't stopping. It was like whoever or whatever it was matching my steps. My breathing grew faster, and I glanced over my shoulder, but I saw nothing, just trees. I was almost back to the cabin when I heard something louder, a sharp snap of a twig. My heart leaped into my throat. I broke into a full sprint, running through the underbrush, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks. I could hear the rustling behind me, getting closer, but I didn't dare look back. I pushed myself harder, desperation building in me. Finally, I burst through the tree line and into the clearing in front of the cabin. I didn't stop running until I reached the door. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it immediately. I stood there, gasping for breath, my body trembling. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind or maybe an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something had been following me. I spent the rest of the evening inside, the uneasy feeling never fully leaving me. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but every little sound outside, the creak of the cabin settling, the wind in the trees, made my skin crawl. The feeling that I wasn't alone in the woods gnawed at me. Night came, and I reluctantly made my way to bed. The silence was suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined I heard movement outside. I lay awake for hours, my mind racing, until exhaustion finally took over. I slept fitfully, waking up multiple times throughout the night, each time convinced I had heard something outside. The shadows in the room seemed darker than usual, the silence thicker. In the morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things in a hurry, not wanting to stay a moment longer than necessary. But as I loaded up the car, I noticed something strange. The dirt path leading away from the cabin was disturbed. The ground was broken up, like someone had been walking there recently, though I hadn't seen anyone. I was out of there before I even finished my coffee. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. But the further I got from the cabin, the lighter I felt. The tension that had built up over the last day started to ease. I tried to brush off the experience, telling myself it was just a product of too much isolation. But the memory lingered. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that something was out there in those woods. Something that wasn't quite right. Looking back, I realized that I'll never fully know what happened. Maybe I did imagine it all. The rustling, the footsteps, the strange feeling of being followed. Maybe it was just the solitude playing tricks on my mind. But there's one thing I do know for sure. I'll never go back to that cabin again. It wasn't the isolation that made it feel so unnerving. It was the strange, oppressive sense of something lurking in the trees. The forest had a way of making you feel small, vulnerable, and exposed. And whatever I heard out there, whatever was following me, I don't think I'll ever forget it. I learned that some places, no matter how beautiful or peaceful they may seem on the surface, hold a strange energy. Something about the woods around that cabin made me feel more like prey than a person. And now I'll always wonder if it was just the wind, or if it was something much darker, something that I'll never truly understand. But one thing's for certain, I won't be venturing back into those woods anytime soon. The day started like any other camping trip. I'd been on plenty of them before, nothing special about it. The sun was out, the air was crisp, and the woods were quiet. The cabin I'd rented for the weekend sat at the edge of a small forest in the middle of nowhere. It was far away from civilization, which was exactly what I wanted. I needed some time alone to clear my head, away from distractions. The cabin was old, the wood creaking with every gust of wind, and the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie. But I was used to it. I had stayed in rustic cabins before, and they never bothered me. In fact, there was something about the solitude that I found comforting. I arrived in the late afternoon, after a long drive. The last stretch of the journey was on a narrow dirt road that cut through thick trees, leading up to the cabin. It wasn't easy to find, but the instructions the owner gave me were simple. As I pulled up to the cabin, the shadows were starting to stretch long across the ground, the sun low in the sky. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, built with rough-hewn logs that had darkened with age. It had a porch with a couple of rocking chairs, and a single chimney puffed a light trail of smoke into the cold air. The roof was made of tin, and there was a wooden deck leading to the front door. I was alone. No one else would be there for days. I took my bags inside, unpacked, and started a fire in the small wood stove. The place smelled like pine and damp earth, the kind of earthy scent you can only get in a place like this. I made myself comfortable, unpacking my food, setting up a spot to read, and just generally settling in. As evening approached, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. The wind outside began to pick up, rattling the trees and causing the cabin to creak. It was cozy, but also a little unsettling. Every time the wind gusted, I couldn't help but imagine the trees outside being just a little too close, their branches brushing against the windows. But it wasn't enough to make me nervous. I was fine. I didn't know how long I had been staring into the fire when I suddenly heard something. It was a rustling sound, not the wind, but something more deliberate, came from outside. I froze, holding my breath. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, a crunching noise like footsteps on leaves. I stood up quickly, my heart thudding in my chest. Was someone out there? I hadn't seen anyone on my way in, and there weren't any other cabins nearby. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and stepped cautiously onto the porch. The beam of light swept across the darkening landscape, illuminating the trees and the trail that led deeper into the woods. The rustling stopped as soon as I stepped outside. For a moment, everything was still, too still. I didn't see anything. I convinced myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. That made sense. I went back inside, double-checking the locks on the doors and windows before sitting down again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't get comfortable. Every sound outside now felt like a threat. The night wore on. I spent the next few hours sitting by the fire, reading and trying to relax, but the feeling of being watched never left. I couldn't get rid of the sense that someone or something was out there. The sound of the wind in the trees, the creaks of the cabin, they all started to feel wrong, like they were hiding something. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed. It was late, and exhaustion was starting to set in. I locked the bedroom door and pulled the covers over me. The bed was firm but comfortable. The fire in the stove crackled quietly in the other room. Still, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were closer. I could hear the crunching of leaves and twigs, the soft shuffle of boots against the ground. They were deliberate, slow, like someone was walking right up to the cabin. My heart started to race. I had to be imagining it, right? There was no way anyone was out there. But the footsteps were unmistakable. I could feel the tension building in my chest. I didn't want to go outside again. I didn't want to confront whatever was out there. But I had to know if someone was messing with me. I grabbed my flashlight and slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The beam of light cut through the dark, and I stepped toward the front door. I opened it just a crack and peered outside. There was nothing, just the dark trees, the empty porch, and the eerie silence of the night. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me. Maybe the sound I heard was just my imagination running wild. I closed the door, locked it, and crawled back into bed. This time, I tried not to think about it. I closed my eyes, trying to sleep, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock. It was soft, almost gentle, but it was there. A single knock on the cabin door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. I froze, not knowing what to do. Who would be knocking at this hour? There was no one around for miles. No one else was supposed to be here. I stayed perfectly still, listening for any other sound. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. 3 knocks, one after another. Couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I needed to move, but my body was frozen, unwilling to react. Then the door creaked open. I didn't hear it open, but I knew it was. The feeling of it was unmistakable. My mind was racing, but my body was slow to respond. I could hear the wind outside, rustling through the trees, but there was something else now. A soft scraping sound, like something or someone was dragging something heavy across the porch. It was the last sound I heard before I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The cabin was silent again. The door was still closed. I was sweating, shaking, but the night outside was still. I didn't know what to make of it. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't go back to bed, not after that. Instead, I sat in the dark, listening, waiting. Every sound outside, every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind felt like it was just another thing to be terrified of. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I didn't dare leave the cabin, not even to check outside. By the time the sun started to rise, I was exhausted, my nerves completely shot. I hadn't slept at all. I spent the next few days trying to forget what happened. I stayed inside, away from the woods. Every night, I locked the door and didn't venture outside, even though the silence around the cabin was starting to feel more oppressive. By the time I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me the entire time. I never went back to that cabin. It was early November when I decided to take some time off and head out to the woods. Work had been dragging me down for months, and I needed to clear my head. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just some quiet, some fresh air, and space away from everything. I found a small, off-the-grid cabin for rent deep in the woods of northern Wisconsin. The listing said it was about 10 miles from the nearest paved road and had no cell service or Wi-Fi. That sounded perfect. I packed everything I thought I'd need: non-perishable food, warm clothes, firewood, a camping stove, a big flashlight, extra batteries, and a good sleeping bag. I also brought a folding chair, some paperbacks, and a notebook. The plan was to stay 5 nights. I figured I'd hike a little, write a little, and just enjoy the quiet. The drive was long, and the last stretch took me down rough dirt roads surrounded by tall, thick pines. The trees grew so close together that sunlight barely made it through. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was late afternoon and already starting to get dark. The place was exactly what I'd expected. It was a simple one-room structure with a pitched roof, wood siding, and a small front porch. There was an outhouse behind it, about 30 yards into the trees. Inside was bare but functional. One cot, a wood stove, a small table with a lantern, and shelves with canned food, matches, and a few old tools. No electricity, no plumbing. I unpacked and settled in quickly, starting a small fire in the stove to take the edge off the cold. Then I set up my sleeping bag on the cot and ate a cold can of chili before calling it a night. The stillness out there was unreal. No traffic, no planes, just the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin walls settling. The first night went by quietly. I woke once to pee and walked out to the outhouse. I noticed how dark it was. It was pitch black beyond the range of my flashlight. Even the stars seemed swallowed by the trees. Still, I wasn't scared. I grew up camping, and being alone in the woods didn't bother me. The next morning, I made instant coffee on the camping stove and sat on the front porch in my thick coat. A low fog clung to the ground, and the world was silent except for a few birds. I spent most of the day hiking the nearby trails, which were barely marked but manageable. I didn't see a single person. That night, I wrote in my notebook, ate some jerky, and read a paperback until my lantern started to dim. On the third day, things started to feel off. I was out walking around the edge of a small clearing about a mile from the cabin when I noticed something weird: tree bark stripped in straight vertical lines. Not like what a bear would do. These were clean, consistent, as if someone had done it with a sharp knife. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe someone used the spot for bushcraft or target practice. But I kept seeing more of them as I walked, trees marked at chest height, almost in a pattern. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up to sounds. Small thuds, distant cracking twigs, and at one point, what I thought might have been footsteps crunching leaves just outside. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened, but everything went quiet. I eventually dozed off from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I didn't find any tracks, but the ground was covered in dry leaves, so it'd be hard to tell anyway. Around the back corner of the cabin, I noticed something strange. A pile of small stones stacked in a neat column about a foot high. I hadn't seen it before. I didn't build it. I assumed maybe some local kids had left it, or maybe it had always been there and I just missed it. Later that day, I walked to the same clearing. More stripped bark. This time, I saw a small bundle tied with twine nailed into a tree, a bunch of twigs, pine needles, and what looked like part of a small animal skull. I didn't touch it. Something about it made my skin crawl. I backed away and went straight back to the cabin. That night, the sounds got worse. Loud snapping branches, then something brushing against the side of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door fast, but nothing was there. I stood out on the porch, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. I left the lantern burning all night and barely slept. On the fifth morning, I knew I had to leave early. My gut told me staying wasn't safe. I packed my stuff quickly, skipping breakfast. I stepped outside to load my pack in the car and froze. There were new piles of stones, 3 of them now, in a triangle formation just in front of the porch. Each pile looked the same height and size. That wasn't there the day before. I didn't imagine it. I felt it in my chest. I was being watched. I didn't waste another minute. I jumped in the car, turned the key, and pulled out fast. The drive back down the dirt road felt endless. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I expected to see someone or something following me. I didn't stop until I was 2 towns away and had signal again. I booked a cheap motel and locked the door tight. Later that night, still rattled, I searched online for anything about the area. I found a few local forums, old blog posts. Apparently, years back, some people had reported finding weird markings and objects in the woods near there. Stones, bones, tree carvings. A few mentioned feeling watched. One person said they found their camp torn apart after a hike. Nothing official, no reports or police involvement, just scattered warnings from people who said they'd never go back. I didn't either. I never returned to that cabin. I never rented anything that remote again. I still go out into nature, but not that far off the map. There was no ghost, no monster, no fairy tale ending. Just something or someone out there who didn't want company. I still don't know what they wanted or why they did those things, but I was lucky to walk away. The worst part is how quiet it all was. No dramatic reveal, no final confrontation. Just a slow buildup of dread, small warnings that something wasn't right. I still think about those stones, the markings, the bundle nailed to the tree. Someone had been close. Someone knew I was there. Maybe they watched me sleep. Maybe they followed me on those trails. Maybe they wanted to scare me off, or maybe it was going to escalate if I stayed. I didn't stay to find out, and I don't plan to ever again. I had always been drawn to solitude. The idea of spending a week alone in a remote cabin, surrounded by nature, seemed like the perfect escape from the noise of daily life. When I found an old listing for a secluded cabin in the mountains, I didn't hesitate. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, warned me that the place was isolated and that cell service was non-existent. That was exactly what I was looking for. The drive up was uneventful. Winding roads led me deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser with each passing mile. The cabin sat atop a hill, overlooking a valley that stretched out endlessly. It was rustic, with weathered wooden walls and a stone chimney. Inside, it was modest but comfortable. A small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and a bedroom with a single bed. There was no electricity, but the cabin had a gas stove and lanterns. I unpacked my supplies, lit a fire, and settled in for what I anticipated would be a peaceful retreat. The first couple of days were idyllic. I spent my time hiking the surrounding trails, reading by the fire, and enjoying the silence. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. At night, the darkness was absolute, enveloping the cabin in a blackness that was both comforting and slightly unnerving. On the third night, I was awakened by a noise. It was faint, a soft thud, like something hitting the side of the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. Silence. I told myself it was probably a branch falling or an animal brushing against the wall. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. GQ 1. The next morning, I decided to inspect the area around the cabin. I walked the perimeter, looking for any signs of disturbance. Near the back, I found footprints, human footprints, leading from the woods to the cabin wall and then back into the forest. They were fresh, the edges crisp in the soft earth. My stomach tightened. I was supposed to be alone out here. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps a hiker had gotten lost and stumbled upon the cabin. But the prints didn't approach the front door. They went straight to the back wall. I decided to stay alert but not let paranoia ruin my retreat. That night, I secured the cabin as best I could, bolting the door and placing a chair under the handle. I kept the fire low and sat in the dark, listening. Hours passed without incident, and eventually, I drifted off to sleep. A loud crash jolted me awake. The chair had toppled over, and the front door was ajar. I grabbed the flashlight and scanned the room. Nothing. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The forest was silent. I closed the door, secured it again, and sat by the fire, unable to sleep. GQ1. The next morning, I found more footprints circling the cabin. Whoever it was had been watching me. I decided it was time to leave. I packed my belongings and started down the trail to my car. When I reached the spot where I'd parked, the car was gone. Panic set in. I was miles from the nearest town with no cell service and no vehicle. I returned to the cabin trying to formulate a plan. I had enough food for a few more days and a map that showed a ranger station about 10 miles away. I decided to rest for the night and set out at first light. That night, the noises returned. Footsteps around the cabin, the creaking of the porch boards, a soft tapping on the windows. I sat by the fire, clutching a heavy flashlight, every nerve on edge. At dawn, I left the cabin, moving quickly and quietly through the forest. The journey was grueling. The terrain was rough, and I was constantly looking over my shoulder. After hours of hiking, I reached the ranger station, only to find it abandoned. The windows were boarded up, and the door was locked. I broke a window to get inside, searching for a radio or any means of communication. The place was dusty and filled with old equipment. I found a radio and tried to call for help, but there was no response. I decided to stay the night, barricading the door and setting up a makeshift bed. Sleep was elusive, every sound amplified in the silence. In the early hours, I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. They circled the building, then stopped. I held my breath, waiting. Eventually, the footsteps retreated into the forest. At first light, I resumed my journey, following the map toward the nearest town. After a day of hiking, I stumbled onto a dirt road. A passing truck stopped, and the driver, a middle-aged man named Carl, offered me a ride. I told him a condensed version of my ordeal, and he nodded solemnly. "You're lucky," he said. "People go missing in those woods." He dropped me off at the local sheriff's office. I filed a report, and they launched an investigation. They found the cabin empty, my car abandoned miles away, and no trace of the intruder. The case remained unsolved. I returned home, grateful to be safe but haunted by the experience. I had sought solitude and found something else entirely. The woods, once a place of peace, had revealed a darker side. A reminder that isolation can be as dangerous as it is alluring. TPS://www.gq.com/story/Paul Tremblay interview. YouTube source equals chat.com. Paul Tremblay is horror's newest big thing. I had always thought of myself as a person who preferred the solitude of nature. My idea of relaxation was spending a few days in a remote cabin, away from the chaos of everyday life. No distractions, no noise. Just me, a few books, the forest, and the sky. The cabin I'd rented for this trip was tucked deep into the woods, far from any towns or paved roads. It was an older structure, weathered but well kept, with a sagging porch and a chimney that had seen better days. Perfect for someone who wanted to be left alone. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, the fading sunlight casting long shadows over the trees. It felt like a typical fall evening. The crisp air, the rustling of the leaves, and the distant calls of birds preparing for night. There was something oddly quiet about this place, though, more than I had anticipated. A silence that seemed unnatural. The cabin's interior was just as I expected. Rustic, with wooden floors and mismatched furniture. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, and the kitchen was small but functional. I was alone. No one to distract me, no one to share my thoughts. That was exactly what I wanted. I unpacked my things slowly, taking my time. The first thing I did was light a fire in the fireplace. I found some dry wood stacked in the corner and set to work, the flames crackling and warming the room. Felt nice, comforting even, but something was off. That feeling crept in subtly, like a shadow lurking just beyond the firelight. I brushed it off at first, attributing it to the unfamiliarity of the place. But the longer I sat there, the more it began to gnaw at me. The walls seemed to close in a little, the silence too deep, too heavy. Even the wind outside sounded different, sharper, more urgent. It felt as though the woods were pressing in on me, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. I decided to push those thoughts away. I had a book to read, after all. I sat down in one of the worn armchairs by the fire and tried to lose myself in the pages. Time passed slowly, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. But I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept wandering, my eyes flicking to the windows every now and then, as though expecting something or someone outside. By the time the sun had fully set, the cabin was shrouded in darkness. I didn't bother turning on any lights. The fire provided enough illumination. But as I sat there in the flickering glow, I began to feel more and more uncomfortable. It wasn't just the silence. There was something about the stillness of the place that seemed off. It was as if the cabin, the woods around it, were holding their breath. I told myself to relax. I made some tea, the steam rising from the cup in the cold air. But the unease wouldn't leave. The longer I sat there, the more I started to notice small things that I hadn't before. A creak in the floorboards, too soft to be the house settling. A strange draft that seemed to come from the walls, not the windows. The occasional snap of a twig outside, like someone or something was moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. It was an old house, and the wind could do strange things to it. But then the noise came again. A low thud, unmistakable. It wasn't a tree branch tapping against the roof or the wind pushing against the walls. It was a solid, deliberate sound, like something or someone had struck the cabin from the outside. My heart skipped a beat. I sat frozen for a moment, straining to hear anything else, but the silence that followed was deafening. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, waiting. I stood up slowly, my mind racing, and walked to the window, peering out into the dark woods. Nothing. The darkness stretched out in front of me, the trees standing like silent sentinels. There was no movement, no sign of anything or anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to push the thought aside, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. It was an old cabin, after all, and the wind could make strange noises. But that wasn't the only thing that was making me nervous. Every time I looked out the window, I felt as though I was waiting for something to appear, something just beyond my sight. My eyes darted to the trees, searching for any movement, but there was nothing there. The sound came again. This time it was louder, closer. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching in the fallen leaves. They were coming from behind the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I stood still for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Should I go outside and check? Call for help? There was no phone signal out here, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I was alone, and that thought made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I crept to the door, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be out there. I grabbed a flashlight from the table and opened the door slowly, stepping out onto the porch. The air outside was cold and crisp, the sky clear and filled with stars. But the silence of the woods was unnerving, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. I scanned the area around the cabin, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and there were no footprints, no disturbed dirt. Nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin, walking slowly around the side, shining the light into the thick underbrush. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves, made my heart race faster. My mind played tricks on me, imagining shadows shifting in the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding, watching me from the woods. By the time I had walked around to the back of the cabin, I was tense, every muscle in my body coiled, ready to react. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and making the trees groan in the distance. The faint sound of branches creaking was the only noise, but it felt different now, not natural. And then, from behind me, came a soft sound, a rustling of leaves. I whipped around, my flashlight cutting through the dark, but there was nothing there. I was alone. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was just my nerves, that's all. I walked back to the porch, feeling the weight of the stillness around me. I decided to stay inside for the night, lock the door, and wait for morning. But as I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back in. The hours dragged on, the fire flickering and popping in the hearth. I tried to distract myself, read more, but every little sound made my heart race. The night stretched on forever, the quiet almost oppressive. It was like the cabin was holding its breath, waiting. Finally, around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know if there was something out there. I grabbed my flashlight again, stepped outside, and started walking toward the edge of the woods. And that's when I saw it. There, at the edge of the tree line, standing just beyond the range of the flashlight's beam, was a figure. A tall, shadowy shape, unmoving. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the figure, but it felt like an eternity. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way. It just stood there, watching. I didn't know what to do. I felt the panic rise in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to turn away. I didn't dare approach. Instead, I stood there, frozen, my flashlight trembling in my grip. And then, slowly, the figure turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. I stayed outside for a few minutes after that, the silence overwhelming. There was no sound, no movement. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, the fear subsided, and I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't see anything else that night. In the morning, when the sun finally rose, the woods seemed peaceful again. The strange feeling I had been carrying with me all night seemed to lift. I decided to leave the cabin early. The woods were quiet, the cabin still, but I didn't want to stick around anymore. The unease was too much. I packed my things, walked back to the car, and drove away without a second glance. I still don't know what I saw that night, or if I saw anything at all, but I never went back. The woods are quiet now, but I know they weren't always. I don't know what was out there, but I'm certain it wasn't my imagination. Whatever it was real, and I'm glad I left before it found me. I drove for almost 5 hours straight before the road started getting narrower and the woods started getting thicker. The last town I passed was about an hour behind me, and my phone had lost reception somewhere around the county line. It was early October, and the leaves had started turning. Reds and oranges hung in the trees like fire. I was heading to a small cabin I'd rented for a week. I found it listed on a site for off-grid getaways. No reviews, just a couple of pictures, a rough map, and a promise of peace and quiet. I needed the break. Things back home had been too much lately. Work stress, barely sleeping, always feeling like I was behind. The idea of being somewhere with no cell signal, no internet, and nobody around sounded perfect. Just me, the woods, and quiet. I didn't even bring much with me. A cooler with food, a couple of books, a backpack with clothes, and a few essentials. I left my laptop at home on purpose. The road up to the cabin turned to gravel, then dirt. The trees pressed in close. The air smelled like damp earth and fallen leaves. I drove slow, the tires crunching. Finally, I saw the clearing. The cabin sat in the center. It was smaller than I expected. Just one story, dark wood siding, a metal roof, a small porch with one wooden chair. There was no driveway, just grass and leaves. I parked off to the side and turned off the engine. It was dead quiet. I got out and stood there for a moment, just listening. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own breath. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It was clean but bare. One main room with a small kitchen, a couch, a table and a wood stove. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. Everything smelled like cedar and old dust. I opened the windows to let some air in, then unloaded the car. There was no power, just a few battery-powered lanterns and a solar panel outside that probably wasn't much use under the trees. The water came from a rain collection barrel, and there was a hand pump by the sink. The toilet was composting. It was about as off-grid as it gets. The first night passed quietly. I lit a few candles and read by lantern light. I listened to the sounds outside, which wasn't much. Occasionally, I'd hear something in the brush, but nothing close. Just animals doing what animals do. I fell asleep early and slept better than I had in months. The second day, I explored the area. There was a narrow path behind the cabin that led into the woods. I followed it for about a mile before it faded away. I kept going a little longer, pushing through undergrowth and stepping over fallen logs. The woods were beautiful. Tall trees, moss-covered rocks, ferns everywhere. I didn't see another soul. Felt like I was the only person for miles. On the way back, I realized I hadn't paid much attention to where I was going. The woods all looked the same. I had to stop and backtrack a few times before I picked up the old path again. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was getting dark. I made a sandwich, lit the stove for warmth, and sat on the porch for a while. I started noticing how quiet it really was out here. Too quiet. That night, I woke up to a noise. It was faint, like a branch snapping. I sat up in bed and listened. Nothing. Just silence again. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer, but I couldn't fall back asleep. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. The next morning, I went outside to look around. I didn't see anything out of place, but I noticed tracks in the soft dirt behind the cabin. At first, I thought they were mine from the day before, but they were fresher, and they were going the other direction toward the cabin. They weren't boots. They looked like old sneakers. The pattern was uneven, like someone was limping. I tried to tell myself someone had been hiking through and just passed by. Maybe a hunter, but there was no reason for anyone to be this deep in unless they were staying here too, and I hadn't seen any other cabins or signs of people for miles. I let it go and went about my day, but I kept thinking about those tracks. That night, I locked the door and pushed a chair under the knob, just to be safe. I kept the lantern on low. Couldn't relax. Every sound outside made my heart jump. Something brushed against the side of the cabin, just once, and I nearly dropped the lantern. I stayed awake most of the night, half expecting someone to knock on the door. The next morning, I checked again. More tracks. This time, they were closer, right up against the side of the cabin. I saw where something had been leaned or pressed against the wall, like someone was standing there, listening. I didn't have any weapons, just a hatchet I'd brought for chopping firewood. I started carrying it around with me. I didn't want to panic. I still had a few days left. I thought about leaving, but there wasn't anywhere to go nearby, and I didn't feel like driving through the woods in the dark. I told myself I'd stay one more night, just one. Then I'd pack up and go first thing in the morning. That evening, it rained, heavy. I stayed inside, listening to it pound the metal roof. Around 10, the rain let up. That's when I heard something. Soft footsteps on the porch. Slow, not animal movement, heavier. I turned off the lantern and stood there in the dark, barely breathing. I could hear it, just standing out there. Then the doorknob rattled, just for a second, just enough. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the stove with the hatchet in my hand until the sky started turning gray. Then I grabbed everything and threw it in the car. I didn't eat. I didn't clean up. I didn't care. I just drove. I didn't even look back at the cabin. I just kept going until I hit pavement again. I didn't stop until I saw other cars, houses, people. I never reported anything. What would I say? No damage, no one I could prove was there. Just tracks and a feeling. I checked the listing when I got back home. It had been taken down. The owner never responded when I emailed. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still think about it. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed one more night. I try not to. I try to forget the sound of the footsteps on that porch, the knob turning in the quiet, the shape of those tracks in the dirt. But it's always there at the back of my mind. I went looking for peace and quiet, and I found something else entirely. Something was out there, watching, waiting, and I left just in time. I've always loved the idea of escaping from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. It's one of the reasons why I decided to spend the weekend in a remote cabin in the woods. I'd heard about this place through a friend who'd stayed there before, and she'd said it was the perfect spot to disconnect from everything. No phone service, no distractions, just nature, peace, and quiet. It sounded exactly like what I needed. The cabin was about a 3-hour drive from where I lived. The last half of the drive was down a long, winding dirt road, barely wide enough for my car. The trees were thick on either side, and the road was uneven, making my car bounce as I made my way deeper into the woods. I could feel the isolation setting in as I drove, and the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of branches in the wind. It felt like I was entering another world, one far removed from everything I knew. When I finally arrived, the cabin didn't disappoint. It was small, made of weathered wood, and sat at the edge of a clearing. The trees surrounded it in every direction, their branches stretching high into the sky. The roof had a slight curve to it, and the chimney released a faint puff of smoke. There was a small porch with 2 chairs, and I could see a well-worn path that led to a lake a short distance away. Everything about it screamed solitude, and it was exactly what I was looking for. I unpacked my car, taking my time as I carried everything inside. The cabin was cozy, with a small living room, a stone fireplace, a kitchen with just the basics, and a bedroom that had a simple wooden bed covered in thick quilts. There were no fancy decorations or luxuries, just the essentials. It felt like the kind of place that had been used for generations, a place that had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical. After I settled in, I decided to take a walk around the property. The sun was beginning to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The air was cool, crisp, and smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. It was the kind of air that made you feel alive, the kind that filled your lungs and reminded you that you were part of something bigger. As I walked along the path toward the lake, I noticed how quiet it was. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird in the trees. The lake was smaller than I expected, but it was beautiful. The water was calm, and the fading light from the sun made the surface shimmer like glass. I stood there for a while, taking it all in, but something about the stillness made me uneasy. There was no movement in the water, no sound of animals coming and going. It felt almost like I was the only living thing for miles. I shook off the feeling and turned back toward the cabin. As I walked, the sun set completely, and the world around me seemed to darken. The air grew colder, and the trees cast long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch out of sight. I didn't feel scared exactly, but I felt aware, like something was watching me, though I couldn't pinpoint what. I brushed it off as my imagination and focused on getting back to the warmth of the cabin. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me and sat by the fireplace to warm up. I made myself some tea and settled in with a book, trying to shake off the strange feeling that lingered in the back of my mind. The crackling of the fire was comforting, and the cabin felt like a safe haven from the world outside. But as the night wore on, the quiet became oppressive. I started to notice sounds that hadn't been there before. Soft creaks in the floorboards, a faint tapping on the walls, and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. It wasn't enough to be alarming, but it was enough to make me uneasy. I tried to ignore it, but my mind kept wandering. The sounds seemed to get louder, more distinct. A tapping on the front door, a creak near the windows. I stood up, walked around the cabin, checking every corner and every door. But everything was locked. Everything was as it should be. Still, the sounds continued, faint but persistent. It was like there was something moving around outside, something just beyond my view. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight, bundled up in my jacket, and stepped outside. The cold hit me immediately, the air biting at my skin as I walked around the cabin. The light from the flashlight danced over the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. I checked the porch, the windows, and even the back door, but there was nothing. The cabin stood silent, still. There were no signs of anything, no footprints in the snow, no disturbances in the leaves on the ground. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. It was probably just the wind or some small animal moving around. I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat down again by the fire, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I couldn't shake the thought that something wasn't right. The night dragged on, and I eventually fell asleep on the couch in front of the fire. I woke up several times throughout the night, startled by the faint noises, but each time, I convinced myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I woke up early, determined to shake off the anxiety that had gripped me the night before. The sun was rising, and the light filtered through the trees, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. I made myself some breakfast and decided to take a longer walk to clear my head. The woods were peaceful in the daylight, and the sounds of birds chirping and the breeze rustling through the trees were a welcome change from the oppressive silence of the night before. But as I walked further into the woods, I started to notice things I hadn't seen before. Small, broken branches, footprints in the dirt, and strange marks on the bark of trees. It wasn't enough to be alarming, but it felt off, like someone or something had been here recently. I shook off the thought, reminding myself that I was just being paranoid again. But I couldn't help but feel like the woods were hiding something, like there was a presence here I couldn't quite understand. I turned back toward the cabin, but when I reached the clearing, I froze. There was something on the porch, a large, dark shape sitting in one of the chairs. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't know what to do. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the figure. It wasn't moving. It was just sitting there, waiting. Finally, I forced myself to take a step forward, my legs feeling like lead. I moved closer, and as I got within a few feet of the porch, I realized what it was. A large, dark coat, hanging over the back of the chair. It wasn't a person at all. It was just a coat left behind. Still, my relief was short-lived. The air around the cabin felt heavy again, like I wasn't alone. I quickly stepped inside, locking the door behind me once more. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I decided to stay up later than usual, hoping to ward off any strange feelings. I kept the fire going and kept the lights on, determined to make it through the night without letting my imagination run wild. But as the hours wore on, the sounds began again. This time, they were louder, more distinct. There was something outside. I was sure of it. I grabbed the flashlight again and stepped outside. This time, I didn't bother checking the porch or windows. I walked straight into the woods, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The further I went, the more unsettled I became. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the night grew colder with every step. The noises grew louder, and I realized I wasn't just hearing things. There was something in the woods with me. Suddenly, I saw it. A figure, standing in the distance, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't make out the details, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I run? Should I call for help? But before I could decide, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer. I rushed back to the cabin, my mind racing. When I got inside, I locked every door, bolted every window, and sat in the corner, trying to catch my breath. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in those woods. The rest of the night was uneventful. I didn't hear any more noises, and nothing else happened. I stayed awake, watching the shadows play on the walls, listening to the creaks and groans of the cabin. I didn't sleep a wink that night, but by morning, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The next day, I packed up my things and left the cabin. I didn't look back. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, but I was too relieved to be leaving to care. I had come to the cabin to escape the world, but in the end, the woods had made sure I would never forget them. It wasn't the peaceful retreat I had imagined. It wasn't even the quiet I needed to get away. The city noise, the constant buzz of notifications, the endless stream of people. It was all too much. So, when I found an old cabin listed for rent in the remote woods of northern Maine, it felt like the perfect escape. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just me and nature. The drive was long and winding, the roads narrowing as I ventured deeper into the forest. Tall pines lined the path, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. The cabin appeared just as described, rustic, with weathered wood siding and a stone chimney. It sat near a tranquil lake, its surface reflecting the sky like a mirror. Inside, the cabin was modest but cozy. A small kitchen with outdated appliances, a living area with a stone fireplace, and a single bedroom with a creaky bed. The air smelled of aged wood and pine. I unpacked my bags, stocked the fridge with supplies, and settled in for a week of solitude. The first couple of days were idyllic. I spent my time hiking the nearby trails, reading by the fireplace, and listening to the sounds of nature. The only disturbances were the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a loon. I felt at peace, disconnected from the chaos of modern life. But on the third night, things began to change. I was awakened by a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was a branch brushing against the window, but the rhythm was too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. The sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling or an animal outside. I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints near the cabin's entrance. They were faint but unmistakably human, barefoot, leading from the woods to the front door and then back again. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't seen another person since arriving. Who would be wandering around here without shoes? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hiker got lost or someone from a nearby cabin was exploring. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to be more cautious, locking the doors and windows and keeping a fire going at night. That evening, as I sat by the fireplace reading, I heard the tapping again. This time it was louder, more insistent. Tap, 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 came from the back door. I stood up slowly, heart racing, and approached the door. I peered through the small window but saw nothing, just darkness. I waited, listening. Silence. I turned the lock and stepped back, unsure of what to do. After a few minutes, I returned to my chair, trying to focus on my book, but the sense of being watched lingered. The following day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin more thoroughly. I followed the footprints from the previous morning, which led into the woods. The trail was overgrown, branches clawing at my clothes as I pushed through. After about an hour, I stumbled upon a clearing with an old, dilapidated shack. Its roof had partially collapsed, and the door hung ajar. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was there. No response. Inside, the shack was empty, save for a few broken pieces of furniture and a pile of tattered blankets in the corner. It looked like someone had been sleeping there recently. I returned to the cabin, unsettled. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the walls, set my nerves on edge. I kept the fireplace burning and a flashlight within reach. Around midnight, the tapping returned. This time, it was at the bedroom window. I froze, listening. Tap, tap, tap. I turned off the lamp and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, a face appeared, illuminated by the moonlight, dirty with matted hair and wild eyes. Our eyes met, and the figure disappeared into the night. I called the local authorities the next morning using the cabin's landline. They arrived later that day, a pair of officers who took my statement and searched the area. They found signs of someone living in the woods, but no trace of the individual. They advised me to leave and offered to escort me back to town. I packed my belongings and left the cabin behind. The sense of peace I had sought replaced by lingering fear. Back in the city, surrounded by people and noise, I felt safer, though the memory of those nights in the cabin still haunts me. I learned that isolation can be both a refuge and a vulnerability, and that sometimes the most unsettling encounters are not with the supernatural, but with the unknown facets of humanity. I had always been drawn to solitude. The idea of escaping the constant hum of city life, the endless notifications, and the perpetual rush appealed to me. So, when I stumbled upon an old listing for a secluded cabin deep in the northern woods, I saw it as the perfect opportunity to disconnect and find some peace. The listing was sparse, just a few grainy photos and a brief description. Rustic cabin, off-grid, surrounded by nature. It was affordable, almost suspiciously so, but I convinced myself that it was a hidden gem. I packed my essentials: clothes, canned food, a first aid kit, a flashlight, batteries, a map, and a satellite phone for emergencies. The drive took nearly 8 hours. As I left the main highway, the roads became narrower and more winding. The GPS lost signal about an hour before I reached the cabin, but I had printed directions as a backup. The final stretch was a dirt path barely wide enough for my car, flanked by towering pine trees that seemed to close in as I progressed. When I arrived, the sun was beginning to set. The cabin stood alone, weathered but sturdy, with a small porch and a chimney that hinted at a fireplace inside. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I felt a sense of accomplishment and relief. Inside, the cabin was modest. A single room with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a wood-burning stove. There was no electricity, but I had brought lanterns and candles. I unpacked, lit a fire, and settled in for the night, listening to the sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant owl hoots, and the occasional snap of a twig. The first few days were idyllic. I spent my time hiking, reading, and writing in my journal. The isolation was invigorating. I felt more connected to myself and the world around me. But as the days passed, subtle changes began to occur. One morning, I noticed footprints near the cabin. They were human, but I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. I rationalized that perhaps a hiker had passed through. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That night, I heard noises outside, soft footsteps and the creak of the porch. I held my breath, heart pounding, but the sounds eventually faded. In the morning, I found the porch door slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it. I decided to be more cautious. I kept the satellite phone close and started locking the door with a makeshift latch. I also began to carry a knife just in case. A few nights later, I awoke to the sound of something, or someone, scratching at the cabin walls. I stayed still, gripping the knife until the noise stopped. In the morning, I found deep scratches on the wood, too high for any animal I knew. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that isolation was playing tricks on me. But the evidence was mounting. I started to feel watched even during the day. Shadows seemed to move just beyond my line of sight. The forest, once comforting, now felt oppressive. One evening, I ventured further into the woods, hoping to clear my mind. About a mile from the cabin, I found a makeshift campsite, an old tent, remnants of a fire, and scattered belongings. It looked abandoned, but not for long. Among the items, I found a journal. The entries were erratic, detailing paranoia, sightings of figures in the woods, and a growing sense of dread. The final entry read, "They're always watching. I can't escape." I returned to the cabin, shaken. That night, the noises intensified, footsteps circling the cabin, whispers carried by the wind, and the unmistakable feeling of being surrounded. I didn't sleep. Writer / and hashtag 039 S Digest 1. At dawn, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly and set out on foot, as the car wouldn't start. The forest seemed to close in on me, every snap of a twig causing me to jump. After hours of walking, I reached the main road and flagged down a passing vehicle. I reported the incidents to the local authorities, who investigated but found no evidence of other people in the area. They attributed the experiences to isolation-induced hallucinations. But I knew what I had felt, what I had heard. Back in the city, I struggled to readjust. The memories of the cabin haunted me. I sought therapy and gradually began to heal. I learned to appreciate the balance between solitude and connection. The experience taught me that while isolation can offer clarity, it can also open the door to our deepest fears. I needed a break. After months of relentless work, I craved solitude. A friend mentioned an old cabin nestled deep within the woods of northern Minnesota. It was remote, untouched by modern distractions, and perfect for unwinding. I packed essentials: canned food, a flashlight, a hunting knife, a first aid kit, and a journal. The drive was long, the roads winding and narrow, flanked by dense trees that seemed to close in as I ventured deeper. Upon arrival, the cabin stood modestly amidst towering pines. Its wooden exterior bore the marks of time: faded paint, moss-covered shingles, and a creaky porch. Inside, it was sparse. A single room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a cot. Dust particles danced in the sunlight filtering through the grimy windows. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and dampness. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire, cooked a simple meal, and wrote in my journal. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, almost therapeutic. The following day, I explored the surrounding woods. The forest was dense, with narrow trails winding through thickets. I noted landmarks to avoid getting lost: a peculiar rock formation, a fallen tree with twisted branches. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The door was ajar. I was certain I'd closed it. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed, but a sense of unease settled in. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the wooden floor, every gust of wind against the walls, heightened my anxiety. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside. I grabbed my flashlight and peered into the darkness, but saw nothing. Telling myself it was just wildlife, I tried to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints around the cabin, boot prints, not animal tracks. They circled the structure, then disappeared into the woods. I felt a chill. Was someone watching me? I decided to cut my trip short. Packing my belongings, I prepared to leave. However, as I started the car, it sputtered and died. I checked the engine, but everything seemed intact. The fuel gauge read full. Perplexed, I tried again, but the engine refused to turn over. Stranded, I returned to the cabin, hoping to find a solution in the morning. That night, the atmosphere grew oppressive. The wind howled, and the trees groaned. I barricaded the door with a chair and kept the knife within reach. Sleep was intermittent, plagued by unsettling dreams and the constant feeling of being watched. At dawn, I ventured outside to seek help. As I trudged through the woods, I stumbled upon a clearing with remnants of a campsite: ashes from a fire, a torn backpack, and scattered belongings. It looked abandoned yet recent. Among the items, I found a map with the cabin marked and notes scribbled in the margins: "Not alone. They come at night. Don't trust the silence." Panic surged. I hurried back, only to find the cabin's door wide open. Inside, my belongings were strewn about, and the journal lay open on the floor. A new entry was written in unfamiliar handwriting: "You should have left." Heart pounding, I realized I wasn't alone. Determined to escape, I gathered essentials and set out on foot. following the trail I came in on. Hours passed, the forest seeming to stretch endlessly. Just as despair set in, I heard the distant hum of an engine. Pushing through the underbrush, I emerged onto a dirt road where a ranger's truck approached. Waving frantically, I caught their attention. Safe at last, I recounted my experience. The ranger listened intently, then informed me that the cabin had been abandoned for years, with reports of mysterious occurrences deterring visitors. Relieved to be away, I vowed never to seek solitude in such isolation again. I had always dreamed of a retreat into the wilderness, a place where the noise of the city faded into the rustle of leaves and the call of distant birds. When I found the listing for a secluded cabin in the northern woods, it seemed perfect. No neighbors for miles, surrounded by dense forest, and accessible only by a narrow dirt road that twisted through the trees. It was exactly the isolation I craved. The drive up was uneventful. The last town I passed through was a small cluster of buildings with a gas station, a diner, and a general store. I filled up the tank, grabbed some supplies, and continued on. As I turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, the canopy of trees overhead thickened, casting dappled shadows on the path. The cabin itself was modest, a single-story structure with a pitched roof, a small porch, and a chimney that hinted at a fireplace inside. The wood was weathered but sturdy, and the windows were intact. There was a generator out back, a well for water, and a woodpile stacked neatly against the side. Inside, the cabin was cozy. A main room served as the living area, with a fireplace, a worn couch, and a small kitchen in the corner. A hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. The furniture was simple but functional. I unpacked my belongings, stocked the kitchen, and settled in. The first few days were idyllic. I spent my time hiking the nearby trails, reading by the fireplace, and enjoying the solitude. The only sounds were the wind in the trees, the chirping of birds, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. On the fourth night, I was awakened by a noise outside. It was faint, a soft crunching, like footsteps on gravel. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other nocturnal animal and went back to sleep. The Writer's College Times. 1. The next morning, I found footprints near the porch. They were human boot prints, leading from the woods to the cabin and back. I hadn't seen anyone since arriving, and the idea that someone had approached the cabin in the night unsettled me. I decided to be more cautious. That evening, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I kept a flashlight and a heavy-duty flashlight beside the bed. Sleep came slowly, and I woke several times during the night, straining to hear any sounds. But the night passed without incident. The following day, I explored the area around the cabin more thoroughly. I found more footprints, some fresh, some older. They seemed to circle the cabin at varying distances. I couldn't tell how many individuals there were, but it was clear that someone or multiple people had been watching the cabin. I considered leaving, but the thought of packing up and driving back through the narrow, winding road didn't appeal to me. I convinced myself that it was probably hunters or hikers passing through. Still, I decided to stay vigilant. That night, the noises returned. This time, they were louder, footsteps on the porch, the creak of wood, and a soft tapping on the window. I froze, gripping the flashlight tightly. The tapping continued for a few minutes, then stopped. I didn't dare move until dawn. In the morning, I found smudges on the window pane, handprints. Someone had been watching me. I decided it was time to leave. I packed my essentials, loaded the car, and started down the dirt road. A research guide for students. 2. About a mile from the cabin, I found a tree had fallen across the road. It looked deliberate, cut cleanly and positioned to block the path. I got out to inspect it, and as I did, I heard movement in the woods. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt eyes on me. I returned to the cabin, barricaded the doors and windows, and waited. The generator provided power, and I had enough food and water for a few days. I kept the lights off at night, hoping to avoid drawing attention. Each night, the noises grew bolder. Footsteps circling the cabin, objects being moved, and the occasional knock on the door. I didn't respond, hoping they would lose interest, but they didn't. On the third night, I heard the sound of something being dragged across the porch. In the morning, I found a dead rabbit nailed to the door. It was a message, though I couldn't decipher its meaning. Fear gripped me, and I knew I had to find a way out. I spent the day preparing. I fashioned a makeshift weapon from a fireplace poker, packed a bag with essentials, and planned to hike out through the woods, avoiding the road. I studied the map, identified the nearest town, and estimated it would take 2 days to reach it on foot. I left at dawn, moving quietly and staying off trails. The forest was dense and progress was slow. I kept an eye out for any signs of pursuit. By nightfall, I had covered several miles and found a spot to camp. I didn't light a fire, fearing it would give away my position. The night was uneventful, and I resumed my journey at first light. Around midday, I reached a dirt road and followed it, hoping it would lead to civilization. After a few hours, I saw a vehicle approaching, a pickup truck. I waved it down, and the driver, an older man, stopped. I explained my situation, omitting the more disturbing details, and he offered me a ride to the nearest town. I accepted gratefully. At the town, I contacted the local authorities and reported the incidents. They promised to investigate. Masterclass 3. I never returned to the cabin. The experience left me shaken, and the allure of solitude had lost its charm. I realized that isolation can be as dangerous as it is peaceful, and that sometimes the unknown is better left unexplored. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dense forest. The gravel road leading up to it had been rough, jostling my old pickup truck and rattling my nerves. The isolation was palpable. No cell service, no nearby neighbors, just me and the wilderness. The cabin itself was modest, built from weathered logs with a tin roof that had seen better days. A small porch wrapped around the front, its wooden boards creaking under my weight as I stepped onto it. I unlocked the door, the key sticking slightly before turning with a reluctant click. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of aged wood and dust. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. Remembering the instructions, I headed to the back to start the generator. It roared to life after a few pulls, and the cabin's interior lights flickered on, casting a warm glow that did little to chase away the encroaching darkness outside. I unpacked my belongings, placing them in the small bedroom to the left of the main living area. The bed was simple, a mattress on a wooden frame covered with a faded quilt. A single window looked out into the forest, the trees standing like silent sentinels. In the kitchen, I found canned goods and bottled water stocked in the cupboards. I heated a can of soup on the gas stove, the flame dancing beneath the pot. As I ate, the wind picked up, rustling the trees and causing the cabin to groan slightly. I told myself it was just the wind, just the natural sounds of an old structure settling. After dinner, I sat on the porch with a cup of instant coffee, the steam rising into the cool night air. The forest was alive with sounds, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. Yet, beneath it all, there was a stillness, a tension that I couldn't quite place. I decided to turn in early, the day's travel having taken its toll. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and climbed into bed. The mattress was firm, the quilt scratchy against my skin. I closed my eyes, listening to the sounds of the night, trying to lull myself to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the walls, set my nerves on edge. I reminded myself that I was alone, that there was nothing to fear. Yet, a nagging feeling persisted, a sense that I was being watched. Sometime in the early hours, I was jolted awake by a loud thud. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear any other sounds. Silence. I waited, holding my breath, but the noise didn't repeat. telling myself it was probably a branch falling or an animal outside. I lay back down, though sleep remained elusive. Morning light filtered through the window, casting a pale glow across the room. I got up, stretching and shaking off the restless night. Determined to make the most of the day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I followed a narrow trail behind the cabin, winding through the trees. The forest was dense, the canopy overhead filtering the sunlight and casting dappled shadows on the ground. Birds flitted between branches, and squirrels darted across the path. After about an hour of hiking, I stumbled upon a clearing with a small, overgrown structure, perhaps an old shed or hunting blind. Curious, I approached it. The door hung ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through gaps in the walls. Old tools and rusted equipment lay scattered about. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A set of footprints in the dirt, leading away from the shed and deeper into the forest. They were fresh. I hadn't seen anyone else, and the area was supposed to be uninhabited. A chill ran down my spine. I considered following the tracks but decided against it. Instead, I returned to the cabin, my senses heightened, every sound amplified. Back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I checked the locks again, ensured the generator was running smoothly, and tried to distract myself with a book. But my mind kept returning to the footprints. As night fell, the wind picked up again, and the cabin creaked and groaned. I sat by the fireplace, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the back of the cabin. I jumped, heart racing. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way to the source of the noise. The back door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. I was certain I had locked it. I closed and secured it, checking the surrounding area through the windows but seeing nothing. Sleep was out of the question. I stayed up, listening, waiting, every nerve on edge. The hours dragged on, the darkness pressing in. At dawn, I decided to cut my trip short. I packed my belongings, loaded the truck, and took one last look at the cabin. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was out there in the woods. I never returned to that cabin. Whatever peace I had sought in its isolation was overshadowed by the sense of unease that lingered long after I left. I needed a break. Life had become a monotonous cycle of work, eat, sleep, repeat. The city's noise was incessant, and I craved silence. So, I rented a secluded cabin in the woods for a week. No neighbors, no internet, no distractions, just me and nature. The drive was long, winding through dense forests and narrow dirt roads. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows between the trees. The cabin stood alone, a modest wooden structure with a porch that creaked under my weight. Inside, it was simple. A small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, a bedroom, and a bathroom. Everything I needed. The first night was peaceful. I lit a fire, cooked a simple meal, and read a book until I fell asleep. The silence was comforting, a stark contrast to the city's constant hum. The next morning, I decided to explore the surroundings. The forest was dense, with towering trees and a thick underbrush. I followed a narrow trail that led to a small stream, its water clear and cold. I sat there for a while, listening to the gentle flow and the occasional rustle of leaves. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it. Inside, nothing seemed out of place. Perhaps I hadn't closed it properly. I dismissed it and went about my day. Every writer, one. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint creaking sound. It was subtle, like someone stepping on old floorboards. I held my breath, listening intently. Silence. I told myself it was the cabin settling or perhaps an animal outside. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. Dabble. 2. The following day, I went for another walk, this time venturing deeper into the woods. I found an old, overgrown path that led to a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated shed, its roof caved in and walls covered in moss. Curious, I approached it. Inside, there were remnants of tools, rusted and broken. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. As I turned to leave, I noticed footprints in the dirt. Fresh ones, leading away from the shed. They weren't mine. A chill ran down my spine. I followed them for a short distance before they disappeared into the underbrush. Unease settled in, and I hurried back to the cabin. That evening, I double-checked all the locks and secured the windows. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I sat by the fire, I thought about the footprints. Perhaps a hunter or another hiker. But the area was supposed to be uninhabited. In the middle of the night, I awoke to a noise, a soft tapping on the window. I froze, heart pounding. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I mustered the courage to peek through the curtain, but saw nothing. The darkness outside was impenetrable. The tapping stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, ears attuned to every sound. The next morning, I found footprints around the cabin, circling it. They were barefoot, the toes clearly defined in the soft earth. Panic set in. Someone had been watching me. I decided to leave, but when I tried to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. I opened the hood and found the engine components tampered with, wires cut, parts missing. Someone didn't want me to leave. I was trapped. No phone signal, no transportation, and someone lurking in the woods. I spent the day barricading the cabin, using furniture to block doors and windows. I fashioned a makeshift weapon from a fireplace poker. As night fell, I sat in the center of the cabin, every light on, waiting. Writer / and hashtag 039. S Digest 3. Hours passed. Then, a noise, a soft thud on the roof. Then another. Footsteps. Someone was on the roof. I held my breath, gripping the poker tightly. The footsteps moved slowly, deliberately. Then silence. Suddenly, a crash. The skylight shattered, and a figure dropped into the room. I swung the poker, connecting with the intruder's shoulder. They stumbled, and I struck again, this time hitting their head. They collapsed, unconscious. I tied them up and waited for daylight. In the morning, I ventured out to find help. After hours of walking, I stumbled upon a ranger station. I explained everything, and they accompanied me back to the cabin. The intruder was gone, the ropes cut. But the rangers found evidence, footprints, the tampered car, the broken skylight. They launched an investigation. I returned to the city, shaken but safe. The experience haunted me, a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk in isolation. I had sought solitude and found terror, but I survived, and I would never take safety for granted again. The drive took longer than expected. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then dirt. Trees lined the path, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. By the time I arrived, dusk had settled in. The cabin was modest, a single room with a small kitchen, a bed, and a fireplace. There was a generator out back for electricity and a well for water. I unpacked my things, lit a fire, and settled in for the night. The first night was uneventful. I slept soundly, the silence of the woods a welcome change from the constant hum of the city. The next morning, I brewed some coffee and sat on the porch, watching the sun rise through the trees. Birds chirped, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. It was idyllic. I spent the day exploring the surrounding area. There was a trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. I followed it for a while, noting the various plants and listening to the sounds of wildlife. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. I shrugged it off as paranoia and continued on. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I noticed something odd. The door to the cabin was ajar. I was sure I had closed it. I checked the perimeter, but saw no signs of intrusion. Perhaps the wind had blown it open. I secured it and went to bed. I awoke in the middle of the night to a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, like someone gently knocking on the window. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The tapping continued for a few moments, then stopped. I mustered the courage to approach the window, but saw nothing. The forest was still. I returned to bed, attributing the noise to a branch or an animal. The next morning, I found footprints outside the cabin. They were human, barefoot, and led from the woods to the porch. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been here. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed my belongings and prepared to leave. Writing Mastery Academy, 3. As I loaded my car, I noticed something on the windshield. A note, written in crude handwriting. "You shouldn't have come." Panic set in. I jumped into the car and turned the key. Nothing. The engine wouldn't start. I tried again, but it was dead. I popped the hood and discovered the wires had been cut. Someone didn't want me to leave. Writer / and hashtag 039 S Digest 4. I retreated into the cabin, locking the door behind me. I had no phone service, no way to call for help. I checked the generator, it was intact. I turned it on, hoping the lights would deter whoever was out there. I armed myself with a kitchen knife and waited. Masterclass 5. Night fell, and with it, the tapping returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It moved from window to window, circling the cabin. I sat in the center of the room, knife in hand, heart racing. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The generator had stopped. I was plunged into darkness. I lit a candle and held it aloft, casting shadows on the walls. The tapping ceased, replaced by silence. I waited, every muscle tense. Hours passed. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. At dawn, I ventured outside. The car was untouched, but the footprints were back, more numerous this time. They surrounded the cabin, converging on the door. I followed them into the woods, hoping to find a clue. After a short distance, they disappeared. No broken branches, no disturbed foliage, just gone. I returned to the cabin and decided to hike back to the main road. It was a long trek, but I had no choice. I packed a bag with essentials and set off. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just silence. I walked for hours, but the path seemed unfamiliar. I should have reached the road by now. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. I turned back, hoping to retrace my steps, but the trail had vanished. The trees looked the same in every direction. I was disoriented, dehydrated, and scared. I stumbled upon a clearing and saw something that made my blood run cold. A replica of the cabin. Same structure, same porch, but aged and decayed. Windows shattered, door hanging off its hinges. I approached cautiously. Inside, the furniture was overturned, mold covered the walls, and the air was thick with mildew. On the table lay a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. I opened it and read entries detailing experiences identical to mine: footsteps, tapping, notes, the feeling of being watched. The final entry read, "I can't escape. The forest won't let me." I fled the cabin and ran blindly through the woods. Branches tore at my clothes, roots tripped me, but I kept going. Eventually, I stumbled onto a dirt road. Relief washed over me. I followed it until I reached a ranger station. I burst in, disheveled and frantic. The ranger looked up, startled. I explained my ordeal, and he listened intently. When I mentioned the cabin, his expression changed. He told me that the cabin had been abandoned for years, ever since a series of disappearances occurred in the area. He said they had closed off that part of the forest, but people still ventured in, drawn by curiosity. I was taken to the nearest town, where I contacted my family. The authorities investigated but found no evidence of anyone else in the area. The cabin I stayed in was gone, replaced by overgrown vegetation. They chalked it up to stress and hallucination. But I know what I experienced was real. Something is in those woods, something that doesn't want to be found. I left the city to find peace, but I found something else entirely. I will never return to those woods, and I warn others to stay away. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After a long stretch of working overtime and dealing with the constant noise of city life, the idea of escaping to a remote cabin in the woods sounded like the perfect remedy. I found the listing online, a small, rustic cabin nestled deep within the forest, miles away from the nearest town. The photos showed a quaint wooden structure surrounded by towering trees, with a serene lake nearby. It was exactly what I needed: solitude, nature, and a break from the chaos. I packed my essentials: clothes, food supplies, a first aid kit, and some books. I also brought along my journal, hoping to document my thoughts and perhaps find some inspiration for the novel I'd been meaning to write. The drive took several hours, and as I left the main highway and ventured onto narrower roads, the scenery changed dramatically. Concrete buildings gave way to dense forests, and the air felt fresher, cooler. By the time I reached the dirt path leading to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the landscape. The path was narrow and uneven, with overgrown bushes brushing against the sides of my car. I drove slowly, careful not to damage the vehicle. After about 15 minutes, the cabin came into view. It was even more charming in person. Constructed from dark timber, the cabin had a small porch with a rocking chair and a stack of firewood neatly piled beside the door. The windows were shuttered, and a chimney protruded from the roof, hinting at a fireplace inside. I parked the car and stepped out, stretching my legs and taking in the tranquil surroundings. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was cozy: a single room with a bed, a kitchenette, a small dining table, and the promised fireplace. There was no electricity, but oil lamps were provided, and a wood-burning stove stood in the corner. I unpacked my belongings, lit a lamp, and prepared a simple meal. As night fell, the forest outside grew darker, and the sounds of nocturnal creatures emerged. I found it comforting, a reminder that I was far from the city's constant hum. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept soundly, lulled by the gentle creaking of the cabin and the distant hoots of owls. The next morning, I woke up early, eager to explore the area. I made a cup of coffee on the stove, packed a small backpack with water and snacks, and set out. The forest was dense, with narrow trails winding between towering trees. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. I followed a trail that led to the lake. The water was still, reflecting the sky and surrounding trees like a mirror. I sat on a rock by the shore, enjoying the serenity. After a while, I decided to venture further, curious about what lay beyond the lake. I followed a less defined path, pushing through underbrush and stepping over fallen logs. As I walked, I noticed signs of wildlife: deer tracks, bird calls, and the occasional rustle in the bushes. It was invigorating being so immersed in nature. However, as the day progressed, I realized I had lost track of time. The sun was beginning to dip, and the shadows grew longer. I decided to head back, retracing my steps, but the forest looked different. The path I had followed seemed to have vanished, replaced by unfamiliar terrain. I tried to remain calm, telling myself that I just needed to find the lake, and from there, I could find the trail back to the cabin. I walked in what I believed was the right direction, but the trees grew denser and the underbrush thicker. Panic began to set in. I checked my phone, hoping to use the GPS, but there was no signal. The battery was also low, as I had forgotten to charge it the previous night. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had read about situations like this. The key was not to panic, to stay put and wait for rescue. But no one knew I was here. I hadn't told anyone the exact location of the cabin. I decided to find a clearing and set up a temporary camp. I had a flashlight, some snacks, and a bottle of water. I found a relatively open area, cleared some space, and sat down, wrapping my jacket around me as the temperature dropped. The forest at night was a different world. The sounds were louder, more ominous. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes made my heart race. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined wild animals approaching or getting more lost. When dawn finally broke, I felt a mix of relief and determination. I needed to find my way back. I tried to recall the direction I had come from, using the position of the sun as a guide. I walked for hours, calling out occasionally, though I knew no one would hear me. Just as despair was beginning to take hold, I stumbled upon a familiar sight, the lake. Relief washed over me. From here, I could find the trail back to the cabin. I followed the shoreline, and after some time, the cabin came into view. I was exhausted, hungry, and dehydrated, but I was safe. Back inside, I drank water, ate some food, and collapsed onto the bed. The ordeal had shaken me. I realized how unprepared I had been, how a simple hike had turned into a dangerous situation. I decided to cut my trip short. The next morning, I packed my belongings and left the cabin, grateful to be alive. The experience taught me a valuable lesson about respecting nature and the importance of preparation. While the cabin had offered the solitude I sought, it also reminded me of the unpredictability of the wilderness. I returned home with a newfound appreciation for safety and the comforts of civilization. I needed a break. Life had been relentless, deadlines piling up, relationships fraying, and the constant hum of city life gnawing at my sanity. When I stumbled upon an online listing for a secluded cabin nestled deep within the northern woods, it seemed like the perfect escape. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just me and the wilderness. The drive was long and winding, the roads narrowing as I ventured further from civilization. Tall pines lined the path, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. By the time I reached the cabin, dusk was settling in, casting long shadows that danced with the swaying trees. The cabin was rustic, a single-story structure with weathered wooden walls and a pitched roof. A small porch extended from the front, its floorboards creaking under my weight as I stepped onto it. Inside, the air was cool and musty, carrying the scent of aged timber and damp earth. The interior was simple: a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchenette, and a door leading to a bedroom. A narrow hallway led to a bathroom at the back. I unpacked my belongings, placing them neatly in the bedroom. The bed was firm, covered with a faded quilt that smelled faintly of cedar. In the kitchen, I stocked the mini fridge with essentials and filled the cabinets with canned goods and dry food. The water ran cold but clear, and the electricity, powered by a generator, hummed softly in the background. That first night, I sat by the fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves outside. It was unsettling at first, but I welcomed the solitude. Days passed in a tranquil blur. I spent my mornings hiking the nearby trails, afternoons reading on the porch, and evenings cooking simple meals. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature: chirping birds, chattering squirrels, and the distant howl of coyotes. I felt at peace, disconnected from the chaos of my previous life. One morning, I decided to explore a less trodden path I had noticed during one of my hikes. The trail was narrow, overgrown with ferns and brambles, leading deeper into the woods. As I ventured further, the canopy thickened, dimming the sunlight and casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. After an hour of hiking, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated shack, its walls sagging and roof partially collapsed. Curiosity piqued, I approached cautiously. The door hung ajar, revealing a dark interior. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay and mold. Broken furniture lay scattered, and the floor was littered with debris. Among the rubble, I noticed a stack of old newspapers and a rusted metal box. The newspapers were yellowed and brittle, dating back several decades. Headlines spoke of missing hikers and unexplained disappearances in the area. A chill ran down my spine. I opened the metal box, revealing a collection of photographs. They were faded, depicting various individuals posing in front of the cabin, my cabin. Some were smiling, others looked solemn. One photograph caught my attention. A man standing on the porch, his face obscured by shadow. The date on the back read, June 1975. Unease settled in my stomach as I left the shack and hurried back to the cabin. The forest seemed darker, the shadows deeper. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows set my nerves on edge. The following morning, I decided to cut my trip short. I packed my belongings and prepared to leave. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed footprints in the dirt, fresh, leading from the woods to the cabin. My heart pounded as I scanned the tree line, but saw nothing. I rushed to my car, only to find the tires slashed and the engine unresponsive. Panic set in. I was stranded, miles from the nearest town, with no means of communication. I barricaded the doors and windows, arming myself with a fireplace poker. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into eternity. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and the occasional distant whisper. Sleep was impossible. I sat by the fireplace, the poker clutched tightly in my hands, eyes darting to every shadow. At some point, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. A loud crash jolted me awake. The front door was ajar, swinging in the wind. I approached cautiously, heart hammering in my chest. Outside, the footprints were back, circling the cabin. I followed them, leading me to the edge of the woods, where they vanished. I returned to the cabin, securing the door once more. Days passed in a haze of fear and paranoia. I rationed my food, conserved water, and kept a constant watch. The forest remained silent, oppressive. On the fifth day, I heard the distant rumble of an engine. Hope surged through me as I rushed outside, waving frantically. A forest ranger's truck emerged from the trees, stopping in front of the cabin. The ranger, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, looked at me with concern. "We've been looking for you," he said. "Your family reported you missing." Relief washed over me as I recounted my experience. The ranger listened intently, nodding occasionally. He informed me that the area had a history of unexplained disappearances, and the shack I had found was known among locals as a place best avoided. I left the cabin behind, vowing never to return. The experience left an indelible mark on me, a reminder of the thin line between solitude and isolation, and the dangers that can lurk in the most unexpected places. I needed an escape. The city noise, the constant notifications, the endless meetings. It was all too much. So, when I found a secluded cabin listed online, promising tranquility amidst nature, I booked it without hesitation. The drive was long, winding through dense forests and narrow paths. By the time I arrived, dusk had settled, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. It was rustic, with weathered wood and a stone chimney, surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Inside, the cabin was modest, a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and a bedroom with a single bed. There was no Wi-Fi, no television, and barely any cell reception. Just what I needed. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fireplace, reading a book, the only sounds being the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I slept soundly, the kind of sleep that only comes when you're far removed from the chaos of daily life. The next morning, I decided to explore the surrounding woods. The forest was dense, with sunlight filtering through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. Birds chirped, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at unseen wildlife. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The front door was slightly ajar. I was certain I'd closed it. Inside, everything seemed untouched, but a subtle unease settled in my stomach. I brushed it off. Perhaps the wind had pushed it open. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard faint footsteps outside. They were deliberate, crunching softly on the gravel path. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped near the window. I dared not move. Minutes passed, feeling like hours, before I heard them retreating. I waited until dawn before venturing outside. There were footprints, fresh, leading from the woods to the cabin and back. I decided to cut my retreat short. Packing my belongings, I loaded them into the car. But when I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again, nothing. Popping the hood, I discovered the engine components had been tampered with. Panic set in. I returned to the cabin, barricading the door with furniture. With no cell signal, I couldn't call for help. I searched for anything that could be used as a weapon, a fireplace poker, a kitchen knife. Night fell, and the forest seemed to close in around me. Hours passed in silence. Then, a soft knock at the door. I froze, heart pounding. Another knock, more insistent. I didn't respond. Eventually, the knocking ceased. I stayed awake, gripping the poker tightly. To first light, I ventured outside. No one was in sight, but the footprints were back, circling the cabin. I decided to follow them, hoping they might lead to a nearby road or help. They wound through the forest, eventually merging with a dirt path. After hours of walking, I stumbled upon a ranger station. Relief washed over me. The ranger listened intently as I recounted my experience. He informed me that others had reported similar incidents in the area. Vehicles sabotaged, mysterious footprints, and unsettling encounters. Authorities suspected a recluse living off the grid, targeting unsuspecting visitors. I returned home, grateful to be safe. The cabin retreat had promised solitude and peace, but it delivered a harrowing experience that reminded me of the unpredictability of isolation. I still seek moments of quiet, but now I ensure they're not too far from help.